Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vicky Wilkins, and I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our half-day conference on Northern Ireland, Past, Present, and Futures. 2021 marks 100 years since the Government of Ireland Act went into force, founding the state of Northern Ireland. That event, in many senses, have been experienced and evaluated differently by distinctive constituencies of people. The title of this conference reflects the idea that multiple perspectives exist on these subjects, and our panels aim to bring a broad set of voices into conversation with each other and with you, the audience. Today, we bring together historians, politicians, and youth leaders to discuss the claims of history, the challenges of the present, and the shape of the future in Northern Ireland. Before we begin, I would like to thank our partners and conference co-sponsors, including the School of International Service here at American University, the Global Irish Studies Initiative at Georgetown University, the Northern Ireland Bureau, and the Washington Ireland Program. And now, please allow me to introduce Mr. Andrew Elliott, Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau here in Northern America. Andrew, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and thanks so much to you and the folk in both Georgetown and American universities for hosting this event here today. It's my great honor and privilege as director of the Northern Ireland Bureau to represent the executive diplomatically here in North America. The office, as many of you will know, has a presence in downtown Washington, DC, and we'll hopefully be seeing at least those of you on the right side of the Atlantic for this at a reception at 5:30 this evening, and very much looking forward to that. As many of you will know, the Bureau is very active right across the US and Canada and has a frequent presence in many other cities as well as DC itself. My pleasant duty today is to introduce our First Minister, Paul Givan, and Junior Minister, Declan Kearney, representing the Deputy First Minister. Paul has been First Minister since June 2021 and represents the Democratic Unionist Party in the Power Sharing Executive. He is a long-standing public representative, having been the youngest ever councillor to be elected to Lisburn City Council, aged 23. He was for quite a period chair of the Justice Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly and until June when he became First Minister. Declan Kearney has been Junior Minister in the Executive since January 2020. He is a senior member of Sinn Féin and is currently the National Chairman of the party. And it's my aim now to hand over quickly to them so that you can hear directly from the ministers themselves on the very many good things that are happening in Northern Ireland at the present time, along with, of course, some of the challenges that we currently face. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction and very kind welcome. Hard to believe I've been in politics now for 17 years, so thank you for reminding me that I've been around the block now quite a bit. But to you and to Dean Gallagher, Professor Carol Myers and Professor Parsons, let me thank you all for the kind invitation to join the conference and to open it for you today. We're delighted to be able to be here, and let me just extend to you a very warm Northern Ireland welcome to each and every one of you. We do know that the American University and Georgetown University, they have had a long working relationship with the Northern Ireland Executive through our Bureau in Washington, DC, and it's through the strength of those relationships that this important and topical conference is now taking place. There's been a long and very close relationship between Northern Ireland and the United States for many hundreds of years, and I'm sure that the distinguished historians that are on the first panel will be able to tell you about that contribution that from the people of Northern Ireland made to the United States. And that includes presidents, artists, community leaders. Indeed, no fewer than 17 past presidents have connections back to Ulster, my home part of the world in County Tyrone, My ancestors grew up along with ancestors of President Simpson Grant, as one of them, who was a County Tyrone native. And since then, the connections between Northern Ireland and the United States have continued to grow and develop in many areas, and that includes the political, economic, cultural, and of course, our academic connections. And the United States, as you know, will have played a very valuable role in securing the political agreements and continuing to support our political institutions through which all of the political parties in Northern Ireland are able to engage on behalf of the people to serve all of our people. So, of course, from time to time, as elsewhere, our politics, it can still be turbulent, but thankfully that now takes place in a much more peaceful environment where people have the confidence and the security to get on with their lives and to make their own decisions about their preferences for the future. You're going to hear from some of our own political representatives during the second panel discussion today, and we have just urged you to listen closely to all of their contributions, because we do hail from a place that is rich, not just in history, but also in our culture, our creativity, and the promise of a better future. Northern Ireland has transformed over the past 20 years and more years into a confident, outward-looking and creative place. It's one that continues to provide a warm welcome to visitors from right across the world. And we hope to see many people from the US visiting our shore soon and experiencing all of the wonderful things that we have to offer. Our industrial, our maritime heritage, music, golfing credentials, screen tourism success, the unique stories, and of course the breathtaking scenery that we have. The Giant's Causeway, to name but one. You've got Titanic Belfast, and you've the walled city of Londonderry, and the forthcoming Game of Thrones attractions are just some of the many places that you should be including in a visit here in Northern Ireland. In addition to our wonderful scenery, Northern Ireland also offers world-class values and supporting infrastructure, which has helped secure high-profile events such as the MTA Europe Music Awards, the Turner Prize, and the Open Golf Championship in 2019. And such was the success of that event, the Royal and Ancient have announced the Royal County Down as their venue for the 2025 Open. So thank you so much for the opportunity to officially open the conference, and hopefully I'm able to hand over to Declan Kearney, who's representing the Deputy First Minister on her behalf. So if I can pass over to Declan, thank you.
Is Declan here?
I understand he's having trouble logging on.
Okay.
Oh, here we
I
go.
believe he's just arrived.
Yep, perfect timing.
Yes, apologies. We've had some technical difficulties on our side here, but I heard everything that Paul said. So I'll pick up just at Paul's point of departure. Thanks, Paul. Agus Shewer Maha Galera Harja Guramaya Vasokt and Corio Hortu of a live Tronona in you. Agus a Parchakans and Kogail Funtak Shaw. Thanks very much, everyone, for having me along today. Unfortunately, the other Joint First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, is unable to join us today, but she has asked that I would pass on her behalf her very best wishes to each and every one of you, and for the remainder of the conference and your deliberations today. So today's conference looks at the past, present, and the future. And it would be remiss of me not at the outset of my remarks and overlapping with some of what Paul has just said, to comment on how much we value our very deep-rooted historical links with the United States. Many of our family, our cultural, political, educational, and indeed our economic ties with the United States are built into the fabric of our society here in the north of Ireland and across the island of Ireland. And over many, many years, the Irish diaspora and many of our friends and our partners across the Atlantic have played a really crucial role in moving our society forward and in helping to develop our politics, and our peace process. Indeed, it is my personal political conviction that the development of our peace process and the success and the irreversible nature of our peace process is in no small measure due to the strategic influence and position of the United States. In many respects, we would not have our peace process were it not for the intervention of the United States and successive United States administrations. So we're very grateful for all of that unstinting support. And indeed, the continued backing of President Biden for the Good Friday Agreement and the ongoing efforts of politicians here in the north and across the island of Ireland to create a peaceful, united and an equal society. The work taken forward by Paul, myself and our other colleagues within our power sharing administration, and also from all of the parties which will be speaking with you later on during this seminar. The title of the conference, Past, Presents, Futures, recognises that there are indeed many different narratives, beliefs and viewpoints here in the north. And while we, of course, have very different views of the past, and indeed we have divergent views for the future of this island as a five-party power-sharing executive, we're absolutely united in our commitment to driving forward transformational change and ensuring that we make this place a better place for all of our citizens, for visitors, and for those who do business here. And we're living through a period of huge change in our society. There is now a debate about the constitutional future. We are living through the consequences of EU exit. We have an impasse around the Irish protocol at this particular point in time. And these present challenges, but there is a resolve here among all of our political parties in the executive to do our best to work together and find consensus. So, Bawailan, Sahi Achrahu, in me Cochran Lafania ag Ahandanya, Achina me Master Akela, Oganya Erakela, agus Gomena Fager at the on Contachnu a winch as Sail Slancho agus Rahul. And we know that there will be, of course, many challenges ahead, but we're confident that innovation is key, that innovation can act as a bridgehead to allow us to extend our global reach, to unlock opportunities to drive growth within our economy, and also to build inclusion within our society, and that will act as a beachhead whereby we can play our part in helping to tackle climate change. And key to success is going to be our highly skilled workforce and what is, frankly, a world-class education system here in the north of Ireland. And our two universities, Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, both attract students from right across the world. And we know that many of the people on your third panel today will have strong connections to both of these institutions through the Washington Ireland programme. As we look forward towards a post-pandemic world and continue to develop our efforts to rebuild our economy, our existing connections with the United States are going to be absolutely pivotal. By sharing, learning and collaborating on educational, cultural and commercial initiatives, I'm absolutely confident that together we can create a greener, fairer and a more sustainable future for everyone, both here and in the United States. In conclusion, my friends, I'd like to extend my thanks once again to the universities for developing today's conference, and to the Bureau, and to the Washington Ireland programme for supporting it. I wish you all a very enjoyable and I hope a thought-provoking day, and look forward to being able to join you in person at some stage in the future in the United States. So Gonyeri go gal leis na kainchna new mile boya Steve Golier. Thanks for hearing from me your time earlier today, but my time late this evening. Very best of luck with the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul Givan and Declan Kearney, first and junior minister. Also, thank you, Andrew Elliott and Vicky Wilsons with the Northern Ireland Bureau and the SPA Dean for getting us started today. And also welcome to panel one. I am pleased to welcome our speakers and moderators, and I hope that you'll turn on your videos now if you haven't already. Thank you. So let me start with Niamh Gallagher. Professor Gallagher is an associate professor of modern British and Irish history at the University of Cambridge, and she is most recently the author of Ireland and the Great War, A Social and Political History, out now with Bloomsbury. I'm also pleased to welcome Dara Gannon. Professor Gannon is a lecturer of Irish Studies and the head of Irish Studies at the University College Dublin. He has a forthcoming book, Conflict, Diaspora and Empire, Irish Nationalism in Great Britain, 1912 to 1922, with Cambridge University Press. And I'm also delighted to welcome Diane Urquhart. Professor Urquhart is a professor of gender history in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy, and Politics at Queen's University Belfast. And she is the author of Irish Divorce, A History with Cambridge University Press. And our moderator is Tim McMahon. Professor McMahon is an associate professor in the history department at Marquette University, and he is the author of Grand Opportunity, the Gaelic Revival in Irish Society, 1893 to 1910 with Syracuse University Press. Thank you so much for coming to meet with us today, panelists, and I'll turn it over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to those who put together this this wonderful afternoon. I know I'm looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists in this session and to hearing more throughout the afternoon. So let me start out, if I could, by addressing a question to Niamh at the beginning of our session. Niamh, your work on the era of the First World War, I think, is pivotally important in understanding the foundations of Northern Ireland and indeed the Republic of Ireland. In part because you put the Irish story into the broader context of this incredibly important event in Europe and the wider world. So I wonder if you could talk about how this moment in European history reshaped discussions around the Home Rule question, partition, and British-Irish relations more generally.
Great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everybody, today. It's a pleasure to speak with you, also from the evening in a very dark and quite dreary Cambridge. Well, in answer to your question, Tim, I mean, where do I begin? It might be useful just to remind our listeners that the First World War was the first, what we call, total war in history. It's a war whereby both the military and civilians are really both targets together, right? And it brings a new dimension to warfare. And the First World War mobilized millions of men, starting off initially, of course, in Europe, but then rapidly moving to the British Empire and other parts of the empire and other empires as well. By 1918, the world had geopolitically transformed, and it's really worthwhile keeping this larger picture in the forefront. Empires that had stood the test of time for hundreds of years, like the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Romanovs, who are part of the Russian Empire, and of course Germany as well. All of these empires decline, break up, are spurred by new nationalist movements in the aftermath of the conflict. The United States comes to power as the first real proper superpower in this age. This is the age when the US really comes to geopolitical dominance, shifting power relations from Europe across the Atlantic. In Britain, the British Empire is severely challenged by the First World War. On the one hand, it seems like it's at its zenith in terms of the land that it occupies, in terms of the power it seems to hold, but at the same time, it's never been more vulnerable. It is incredibly in debt to the USA, and that war debt, it takes the guts of 100 years to actually pay off. It has borrowed hugely and extensively from its colonies, not least of all in India, borrowing the entire annual revenue of India in 1917, of course, naturally without the people's consent. So money, finance, acquisition, I mean, this is all part of the politics that policymakers are grappling with in the aftermath of the First World War. Ireland is absolutely a part of this. This is the island of Ireland, still within the United Kingdom, has been since 1801 and will be until 1921, right when after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So we're still engaged with a context here in which Ireland is a part of the UK within the wider British Empire. And Ireland is absolutely viewed in an imperial way, in an imperial lens. Now, of course, there's a domestic aspect to this. The Anglo-Irish troubled relationship has gone on for a very long time, and one could certainly look at it in an internal sort of framework just within the two islands. But to neglect the empire is to neglect what's really going on within Ireland and thinking about home rule and partition during its aftermath. There, as we know, the 1916 Easter Rising sparks a nationalist radical movement. It already had existed. Sinn Féin itself had been formed in the early 1900s, but really comes to prominence thereafter because British policymakers mistakenly think that the rising rebels are indeed Sinn Féin, who gain a lot of political capital by this, winning their first election in December 1918. They win 73 seats, and the Old Irish Parliamentary Party that had been the champion of Home Rule is effectively consigned to the doldrums. Now, Unionists do very well in what later becomes Northern Ireland too. So they do very well in Ulster, gaining more than 30 seats. So really, it seems like a very split electorate. In some ways, no real, well, not totally different to what it had been in earlier decades when you had that nationalist unionist split, except now the two parties seem even more divergent in terms of what their aims are. So this is all part of the context that British policymakers are trying to grapple with. To see partition as just an internal solution, I think would be mistaken. It is a favoured tool of policymakers throughout many European countries in the aftermath of the First World War, not least in Upper Silesia, as Tim Wilson has written about, Anatolia as well. But in Ireland, when partition itself happens, this is seen as, ironically, a tool to manage divided populations. And it seemed to be a way to end that question, as opposed to creating a new question, which of course animates Irish politics for the rest, for another 100 years. But I'll pause there, Tim, in case you want to ask any further questions.
Thanks, Niamh. That's a great beginning for us. I'm actually going to shift over to Dara here for just a minute. I think Niamh has really given us a terrific opening there, Dara. I should also say before I ask the question to people who are watching that we will be open to questions. We're going to talk amongst ourselves, the four of us here, for a good bit of this next period. But along about 1:35, 1:40 in the US, Eastern time, I suppose that's about 7:30 in the UK and Ireland. We'd welcome some questions from the audience. Dara, just to pick up on what Niamh was saying there, I mean, this is a world question, is it not? I mean, especially in the context not just of the British Empire, but the Irish diaspora that had expanded so dramatically in the 19th and early 20th centuries were engaged in the question of home rule or an Irish independent state, or indeed the creation of Northern Ireland. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to those contexts, the transnational implications of this global moment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim. So first of all, again, just to thank the American University, Georgetown University, the Northern Ireland Bureau, and the Washington Ireland Programme for the kind invitation to speak to you today. And a special thanks to Kimberly Cowell-Myers, Carolyn Gallagher, and Colleen Parsons for bringing together this wonderful conference this afternoon in the US, this evening in Ireland. I think you raise a very pertinent question, Tim, because I think the Irish question is misleading in terms of those parameters, as Niamh has outlined. It was very much a global question, certainly after the First World War, when the issue of home rule had been seen to be transformed by the war, but also by Woodrow Wilson's declaration of self-determination for all nations. And self-determination really becomes the lingua franca of the idea of independence for aspiring nation states from late 1919 and early 1919. And Wilson himself, of course, as the American president, had Ulster Scots lineage. His grandparents came from County Tyrone, and he himself in 1909 stated that he's proud to have Ulster blood in his veins. Now, Wilson, I think, captures the zeitgeist of the day in a different manner. He calls Ireland the great metaphysical tragedy of the day. And I'd like to pick up on that quote because I think in many ways, by looking at this global context and looking at Ireland in a transnational context, we can see in a comparative way that Ireland and the idea of partition in Ireland had potentially alternatives. There were alternative Ulsters, if you excuse the expression, in 1919 to 1921. So if you take the peace conference in Versailles as an example, it was being termed by some historians as the laboratory of sovereignty, that ideas of self-determination, partition, rights for minorities, etc., were being developed, experimented with, essentially, in Paris. And Woodrow Wilson and David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister of the day, were leading that experiment and trying out new forms of sovereignty, redrawing the maps of Europe. And so if you take partition in Ireland laterally in comparison to other parts of Europe, you see that there were alternatives to the Northern Ireland, which developed in 1921. So for example, in the Saar region of southwest Germany, to avoid the contestation between France and Germany over that territory, the Paris Peace Conference suggested that there should be a plebiscite to decide after 15 years where that territory should belong to. In Poland, the newly established state of Poland, minority rights were guaranteed by the League of Nations, again, in contrast to Northern Ireland, where that was not enshrined in the legislation. And interestingly as well, in modern day Poland, the city of Danzig or Gdansk, which was landlocked and which was a German majority population within the Polish state, was declared as a free city or a city state. And evidently, later in the 20th century, we would have the Free City of Derry in a very different context. But it shows that in that sense of spirit of experimentation, which Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson were engaged in Paris, that there were alternative Ulsters to the Northern Ireland, which we got in 1921, perhaps more equitable, certainly in terms of minority rights, etc. I'd also like to speak briefly to the diasporic aspect, Tim, which you quite correctly bring out. And I think the diaspora, in terms of the Irish question, gains greater traction again after the First World War, when Home Rule, which is seen to be between 1912 and 1914, certainly, an internal question. Ulster Unionists, challenge Home Rule in Parliament and in Ulster itself. But after 1919, the arena changes and the United States becomes a key strategic arena, not only for Irish nationalists, but also for Ulster Unionists as well. And there's a very interesting example of that in 1919. So as you may know, Eamon de Valera, who is the leader of the Sinn Féin movement, which Niamh mentioned earlier, travels to the United States in June of 1919, seeking recognition of the newly established Irish Republic by American President Woodrow Wilson. And he styles himself, of course, in American terms. He is now the president of the Irish Republic, as opposed to the Príomh-Aire or prime minister. And he goes on a very successful 18-month tour, raising about $65 million in today's money for the cause of Irish nationalism. And that has gone down in the history books as one of the great success stories, one of the great transatlantic stories, if you will, of this period. But it's a less well-known story is that of an Ulster delegation, a 7-man Ulster delegation, which traveled to the United States in November of 1919. And this was a means to try and counteract the Republican narratives which were being espoused by de Valera and others. And this was a 7-person delegation led by William Coote, who is MP for South Tyrone. And it was contained 3 Methodist clergymen, 3 Presbyterian clergymen, and an Episcopalian clergyman. Now, they went on a remarkable tour in their own right of 24 cities in 3 months, and they secured resolutions from church bodies demanding that the United States cease interference in Irish politics, believing that the US president would be positive towards Irish nationalism. But what I think is quite interesting about this delegation and the discussions which emerged from it is that if you look at partition and how it was decided during this period, it's very often decided at the level of high politics by senior British political figures, Irish nationalists and unionists and so on, behind closed doors. So for example, in 1917, we have the Irish Convention held behind closed doors at Trinity College. In 1921, we're marking the centenary of the Anglo-Irish Treaty this month, again, behind closed doors negotiations as to the fate of Ulster. And ultimately, and Tim, you've written extensively on this as well, the Boundary Commission in 1925, the borders of the newly established Northern Ireland were decided behind closed doors. But if you look at the Ulster delegation, in 1919 and 1920 in America, De Valera's tour, and there's also a Protestant Friends of Ireland, which sought to present the Irish nationalist case by Irish Protestants. There was a very visible presentation of the various arguments for and against partition. And this is in contradistinction to the private negotiations in Ireland itself. So I think those cultures which Americans treasure, freedom of expression, freedom of association, were very important to the public discussion of partition a century ago.
Thanks, Dara. That's fantastic. Very interesting, and we'll definitely come back to that that transatlantic tie. Diane, I wonder if you know, some of what Dara was talking about there involves ground level organization, and of course, so much of what was happening in Ireland itself, and especially in what would become Northern Ireland, was significant ground level organization, not just of men in Ulster, but also of women in Ulster. And it seems to me that that's a key component of what drove the politics as well. So if we move out of the realm of high politics, but connected to it, there's a lot of ground level activity going on that shapes the question, the Irish question and the Ulster question in this period as well, isn't there?
Absolutely, and good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those in my time zone. And can I echo my fellow panelists' thanks for the invite and for organising such a great committee. Yeah, Tim, it's a great question, because I think at this more popular level, we can find a way to gain an insight into the reality of partition and read it as a very human story. I think sometimes it can be read in a very sterile way. It is about high politics. It's about a geographical boundary. But I think recent work is looking at it in a different way. Picking up on Dara's point on this kind of private, you know, conversation and a more public one happening on the other side of the Atlantic. That's fascinating for us, because of course the partition of Ireland was never put to the electorate. And I think more popularly, some people presume that then it was foisted on Ireland by a post-war coalition government desperate perhaps to settle that long-standing Irish question, which Niamh was referencing earlier. In response to that, I think we have to think about how new was the idea of partition, and the quick answer to that is not very. Certainly being discussed from 1912. And I think interestingly, taking various configurations, I mean, sometimes as small as 2 counties of Ulster, more popularly 4, 6 counties, but also should it be the 9-county province of Ulster. So this is in no way determined or fixed. And even if we take it to 1920 with the Government of Ireland Act taking a year to pass, so thorny was its passage through Parliament, but it was the 9-county option, which was the one that was favoured by the Unionist leader, Sir Edward Carson, as well as many who thought that it might aid the future reunification of Ireland. So this idea that this is a temporary salve rather than a permanent one, I think emerges quite strongly. And the decision to opt for what became Northern Ireland, that 6-county configuration, was of Unionist making. And again, at a popular level, sometimes people are surprised to hear that. And it was a decision not based on an adherence to, of course, pre-existing provincial boundaries, because we would have gone for 9 counties if that had been the case. Wasn't based on a decision regarding economic viability or popular will, but rather essentially a religious headcount to try and establish a Unionist power bloc in what would become the new state of Northern Ireland. So, I mean, just in brief, but a 9-county province would have been 56% Protestant. And if you took that down to the 6 counties that became Northern Ireland, it's 66%. And to quote James Craig, the Unionist second in command and soon to be first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, he said, and I quote, "No sane man would undertake to carry on a parliament with such a small majority." And you know, that's essentially what's driving this and some of those final decisions, as Dara referenced, being taken in private. So there's a duality to partition. So the border is separating not just north from south, but it's also splitting the province of Ulster, and the former has often been overshadowed by the latter. But at a ground level, to many, the loss of those 3 Ulster counties of Cavan, Donegal and Monaghan was very acutely felt. People talk about a sense of betrayal and of loss. And many of them had signed, of course, the Solemn League and Covenant, those foundational texts of unionism, that former covenant signed, of course, by men, and its lesser known female equivalent, the Women's Declaration, signed by 16,000 more women in Ulster than men signed the covenant. So people coming out in their droves to sign those documents and signing them in good faith, determining to use whatever means they needed to resist Home Rule. So people felt that the Covenant and Declaration had been betrayed by partition. And we can see this. Northern Unionists feel very guilty and are often saying to their Southern colleagues, again, who have been members of these more popular unionist organisations, that they were making the ultimate sacrifice. So interesting terminology being used there, particularly in that post-war era, as Niamh was referencing for us. We know Southern Unionists walked out of the Ulster Unionist Council meeting that actually ratified six-county partition. There were resignations from the Ulster Unionist Council, from the Ulster Unionist Council, and many other more popular organisations. And we also see the creation of the Anti-Partition League. So again, people really rallying together to try and fight this. And I think just briefly, if I may, from a different political perspective, to think about that sense of betrayal, because it was shared by many Northern nationalists placed in a state that they neither wanted nor recognised. And we see some temporary optimism being offered by the Boundary Commission, which Dara had mentioned. And that was Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. And I think initially in the first year of the Northern Ireland State and the Irish Free State, which follows, the Boundary Commission raises both hopes and fears about the permanence of this border. And in some ways, I think, was a very disrupting force. Of course, we know when the Boundary Commission reported in 1925, it didn't change much geographically. But I think we need to think beyond that and think about what message was actually being sent about now the permanence of partition and that border. So I shall leave it there.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think, one of the things that strikes me so much in thinking about the Government of Ireland Act and then ultimately the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, that, as you say, raises the prospect of the Boundary Commission to redraw the boundary. But one of the things that strikes me as distinctive, indeed very different about the Government of Ireland Act, is that they're not just partitioning a part of Ulster, but the law actually creates a parliament for the 6 counties, which prior suggestions of partition didn't really talk about. Before, even in the wake of the Easter Rising, when Lloyd George is negotiating with both the Home Rulers and with Unionist leadership, and they are talking about a 6-county partition, they're not yet talking about a parliament for that 6-county territory. They're, I think, still speaking about direct rule. So that new parliament and the new structures that are created so quickly in 2021, I think also fundamentally alters the equation, doesn't it, Diane?
Absolutely, and the speed that you highlight, Tim, is really important, because this hadn't been what unionists have been talking about. There's some interesting comment runs in the contemporary press, saying that unionists until this generation weren't thinking in terms of 2 Irelands. They saw themselves as an all-island entity. Yes, there was a distinct identity for both Northern and Southern unionism, and the latter then evolves into a more Ulster-centric unionism. And again, James Craig, who I mentioned previously, very much a driving force behind that. But the fact that, yes, there is going to be this assembly, initially there was nowhere to house it. They weren't in Stormont buildings as we know today, with, interestingly, not Craig, but Carson, the statue that marks that in a very defiant and characteristic pose of, fist raised and so on. That wasn't theirs. Where are we going to meet? And we've also got to think about the nature of this new state being born into violence. And it's a violence that increases very considerably, not just in Belfast, although that is the epicenter of it, but, we have an excess of 500 people in the new Northern Ireland, losing their lives, the bulk of them civilians, and a very high level of Catholic casualty, much beyond their representation, certainly in Belfast population. So it is a difficult birth, and I think that also doesn't justify, but maybe helps us understand the nature of the government as it actually evolves.
Absolutely. And this brings me into some thoughts that both Niamh and Dara brought to mind as well. When the comparisons are made to the continent and to let us say Saarland or to Poland, and the changing of boundaries on the continent, there are options for things like plebiscites there, which are not allowed ultimately even by the Boundary Commission in the mid-20s. And I wonder if maybe you could talk about some of the distinctions between the way that the Irish situation was handled and what was happening with partitions on the continent. And I'll throw that to both Niamh and Dara, maybe Niamh first and then Dara after that.
Thank you. Well, I realised in the course of hearing the others speak, there were a few pertinent points I probably should have gotten across, but I'm quite glad I can make them now at the end rather than at the start. And I touch on this, Tim. What was different about Ireland than partitions elsewhere, or indeed, as you say, plebiscites elsewhere? Well, on the one hand, the fact that the British Empire was in such difficulty, as I outlined before, is really quite central to the outcome. Policymakers are seeing what's happening all across Europe. They're seeing both revolution and counter-revolution from the fall of empires and new nationalist movements that are arising. This is the era for new blueprints to order the world. Fascism, communism, this is when they're coming into vogue, and they're mobilizing many men who are effectively veterans from the First World War into these new movements. And for a lot of people, Bolshevism and fascism seem like very dangerous things, particularly Bolshevism. And policymakers in London are quite concerned about this. Now, they're not the only ones. The Catholic Church in Ireland, for example, sees this new alliance of working class men to be the most horrific thing that could possibly strike the continent because it is a secular movement. Similarly, the new Ulster Unionist Party is talking about Bolshevism as a sort of revolutionary threat that could destabilise Northern Ireland, and linking Bolshevism to actually the republicanism of Sinn Féin. So you have politicians creatively looking at what's happening on the continent and trying to use that to shape their own circumstances. Why is Britain concerned about Ireland in this, and why is the island of Ireland treated differently to other countries? I think this comes down to how policymakers are thinking about the empire. And we've talked about partition as a solution and why a parliament is created, which seems quite strange given it wasn't mentioned in previous years. It's probably worthwhile mentioning that partition is only one of several solutions on the table, and really until quite late in the day, that are very particular to the circumstances of both the United Kingdom and the Empire. From the 1880s, Joseph Chamberlain, who's a radical MP, first of all associated with the Liberal Party, and he splits from the Liberal Party over the issue of Home Rule in 1886. He then goes and forms the Liberal Unionists, a kind of uneasy coalition that sit with the Conservatives. He evokes this idea of imperial federation, right? A stronger empire, in a way not entirely dissimilar to the idea of creating a sort of preferential both trading area, political area that you're calling your own, that you keep members who are in the club together and they benefit from it, right? That has some resonances today for those of us who've lived through the Brexit squabbles, I should say, over the last 5 years. And indeed outcome. But Chamberlain is talking about this in 1886, and indeed he evokes a movement for imperial federation, a way of federating the United Kingdom, so therefore including Ireland, and mainly the white dominions, because this is very much a white man's era as well, right? The politics of race are quite key. Federating the empire in a way that's much more aligned to, let's say, the modern United States. several states together who all have a degree of independence under one sort of federal union. So this idea is very much in vogue for Britain and therefore for Ireland too, well into the 1910s. So right during the era when partition is even floated as a solution. And there was much more support for this sort of a policy than indeed there was for partition in that early part of the struggle pre the First World War. An even more significant and popular proposal was the idea of home rule all round. And this, I think, is where the idea of a parliament for Northern Ireland eventually ends up coming from. This was in a way, as kind of a number of politicians across the political spectrum thinking about devolution. Now, devolution is effectively what happens across the British Isles, so within the UK, not the British Isles, sorry, at the end of the 1990s under the new Labour governments, so often called the Labour governments, Tony Blair, for example, being Prime Minister at the time. What was devolution? Effectively, this was a parliament for Scotland. It was a parliament for Wales. Clearly a parliament for Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland already had one, however. This is in the 1990s. And then thinking about whether or not England should devolve any further sovereignty too. Back in the 1910s, this was a radical idea. And it was proposed by Winston Churchill, or at least he was very keen on it for a while, Leopold Amory, who ends up playing a major role within government, and Lloyd George, who's also quite warm to this idea for a while too. And Home Rule all round would have, in some ways quite similar to the 90s, created a parliament in Scotland and Wales, that much is a given. It might also have created a parliament in England, that's where it's slightly different. And then in Ireland, it was either one or two parliaments, not really sure on what to do. But this was, again, another proposal that was quite popular amongst MPs that was considered quite late into the day. So I think by comparing with Europe, it's certainly one way to do it, but I think it's also quite important to maintain, keep an eye on those other solutions that were proposed, and not least only those, the idea of a dominion, that Ireland would become a dominion like Canada and Australia, i.e. a white dominion, was also floated quite late in the day by the Trades Union Congress, and indeed other members of Parliament, this is British Parliament, were thinking of other solutions for Ireland even late into 1919, at the very same time Walter Long is thinking about and trying to develop this idea of partition. And this is the county opt-out scheme, i.e. counties that don't want to be a part of Home Rule Ireland can therefore opt out of the measure. So in summary, I think we need to remember that partition is one of several solutions that's on the table until relatively late on in the day. As already has been outlined, partition was, and this particular act of partition was really an act made behind closed doors. And I might disagree slightly with Dara on this one. I think the 1917 Irish Convention is quite different. It has many more representatives within it, whereas the Government of Ireland Act that comes into place in 1920 effectively is done without zero consultation of any groups, and maybe some private phone calls with some Ulster Unionists, but even then it is not, as Diane has eloquently outlined, a proposal agreed by all Ulster Unionists across the 9 counties. And indeed, as Charles Townsend's new book shows, there is still considerable unease within the entire Ulster Unionist Party regarding the solution that is eventually arrived at. Not just from Unionists in the 3 southern counties, but also from some of those in the 6 that remain and become Northern Ireland too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly both James and Charles Craig intervened in the wake of the Long Committee report, which had recommended a 9-county partition, and they as Diane said, they basically were counting heads and recommended that the draft be 6 counties, which ultimately Balfour would sign off on and I think bring before the cabinet. But Dara, I want to go back to you now on this question about the comparison to other partitions, give you a chance to speak. And then I would just say a number of you are already starting to put in some questions in the Q&A function. And after Professor Gannon speaks here, I'll start going through some of those questions with our panel. So Dara.
Thanks, Tim. I think it's very interesting to look back again at the kind of, the alternatives that could have transpired and that has been outlined as, by Dan and Niamh as well in previous contributions. I think it's quite interesting to look at maybe the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations almost as a cockpit for those experimentations, because again, we are marking the centenary as we speak in November of 2021. And if you look at the negotiations which Collins and Griffith, who went to Downing Street and met with David Lloyd George, Churchill, Birkenhead, Austin Chamberlain, you can see that there were kind of various attempts to try and, square the circle, so to speak. And underlying this was a belief on both sides of the negotiating table that the present Northern Ireland polity would not last long if a boundary commission, for example, was established. Now, there's an interesting aspect to this which perhaps hasn't been touched on, and that is the nationalist viewpoint. The kind of standard nationalist viewpoint of 100 years ago was that if British intervention was removed, that nationalists and unionists would somehow find common cause and would find accommodations between them. And that is the basis, for example, for the Irish Republican negotiating position. They don't ask for the removal of the Northern Ireland Parliament, which is already extant when the treaty negotiations begin per se. They seek for essential unity. And that is, they're willing to accommodate unionist concerns within an independent Ireland. So whether that is a unionist devolved parliament within a Dublin republic, for example, or whether parts of the Northern Ireland territory come in under the new independent Ireland. Those are options which Collins and Griffith are exploring. And what's quite interesting across the table is that David Lloyd George, who of course is the kind of arch nemesis of Irish nationalists during this period, during the War of Independence specifically, is quite conciliatory, at least rhetorically, to the nationalist position. He ultimately establishes a boundary commission, Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and also which allows for a Council of Ireland bill, which in theory will allow for powers between north-south powers to administer over the entire island. And if you look at the private correspondence of British PM David Lloyd George, he isn't convinced by James Craig's position that there should be a Northern Ireland Parliament. Craig actually pushes during these negotiations for Dominion status for Northern Ireland, and Lloyd George rebukes him for this and says that's not acceptable. So there is an element, again, of a very fluid situation, certainly in late 1921. And I think Diane's point that these polities were born into violence needs to be remembered, because by nature then we have compromise. We have political compromise with the view to political necessity. But what also needs to be borne in mind is that there were peace processes 100 years ago. Most famously in early 1922, we have two pacts between James Craig as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland and Michael Collins as the emerging leader of the putative Irish Free State, which essentially sought to prevent the escalation of violence in Northern Ireland specifically, but also sought to improve North-South relations at that time. Now, they weren't long-lived, and Collins also had ulterior motives in terms of destabilizing the Northern Ireland polity. But I think it's important to recognize those various shades of grey, notwithstanding green and orange.
Great, thank you, Dara. Yeah, the question of Dominion status for Northern Ireland is really quite interesting. The denial of it by the British government, I think, is interesting. It's reflected even, in as public a way as the British Empire exhibition in 1924, 1925, where Dominions actually have, exhibit halls and so forth, and Northern Ireland does not. There is a Northern Ireland exhibit, but it's within the section of the British portion on industrialization. Northern Ireland actually is essentially pigeonholed there. It does make sense given the incredibly important role of heavy industry in Northern Ireland, to be sure, but it reflects that lesser status that Northern Ireland was still accorded by the UK state. Let me go to a couple of these questions that are in the chat. A few of them are more contemporary. I'm going to hold them maybe toward the end. And go first to a question from Mehi Ramos. Pardon me if I've mispronounced your name. What did women's movements look like? And were there certain points where women were more or less involved in political life? I might put that to Diane, since you've written a good deal about this question.
Thank you. And no, it's a great question. And I think we're still finding out more and more about what women did in this period, not just in Northern Ireland, but island-wide. And in whatever political side they were on, they were always having to negotiate gendered boundaries. Sometimes it was by accepting them fully and having this notion of, their work being equal to men's, but essentially different. That would very much characterize the female unionist movement. At other times, there is a negotiation of boundaries and a little bit of a careful tweaking of it. So you keep people on side as you push and maneuver. And I think if we look at sort of early histories of this period, you know, where women feature, well, it is often in a marginal way or sometimes totally excluded. But when they do start to get written in, again, I think it's sort of fulfilling part of the sort of female ideal. It would be as you know, maybe the nurse during the 1916 Rising, or you know, providing perhaps a safe house, you know, during the War of Independence, for example, working for a body like Cumnam on the Women's Council. But we've got such amazing online archives now with the Bureau of Military History and the Pensions Collection. We have a much fuller picture. And gender history often has, I think, the potential to be a very disruptive force, and that would be a point that I would bring to this, you know, because it's, I think, causing some revision of history and of commemoration, because women were visible the whole way through this, say, regardless of political persuasion. It ebbs and flows, but they're also negotiating with feminism. Niamh was brilliantly describing a lot of the isms that start to emerge, Bolshevism and so on. Feminism needs to be in there as well. And a lot of mainstream political parties were fearful of what this might mean, what equality might mean, giving women the vote. That's very carefully managed in 1918. And I think they give as little as they really feel they can. And, you know, it's 1928 before we have equal suffrage. But even thinking about, you know, first elections to Northern Ireland Parliament, you know, Craig, who actually was pro-suffrage and was on suffrage platforms to about 1910, then interestingly disappears and prioritises unionism over feminism. But he's telling women at that point to be patient. Carson goes even further and tells women, you know, voting for the first time to that new Parliament, to vote for the man who best represented their views, the idea that the time is not right for this. So again, trying to hold women in check. They managed that to some degree, but I would say, you know, the two women elected in 1921, Julia McMordy and particularly Dara Parker. Parker's an absolute stalwart of unionism, and has a very significant imprint over some of the very troubling decisions that are made in regard to housing and education. The only women during the lifetime of that Parliament ever to get to cabinet status. So regardless of all of these kind of competing forces and the decisions that many women and men had to make about what to support, women are there, women are visible, and now the history looks very different from it did even 30 years ago, because we're including them. And it's not just, you know, to say, well, women did this. We've got to think about how they interacted with these male movements. Did they show leadership? They often did, and they had something very distinct to contribute.
Right,
right. So
absolutely.
I don't know if other colleagues want to come in and comment on that.
Let me go ahead, Niamh. You're.
Are you sure? Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
That was brilliant. That was fascinating, and you're completely right. That's another ism that has to be brought into it. Probably just worthwhile pointing out that maybe the slight contrast is that feminism is a really strong force in the suffrage movement across the UK in the 1900s. I mean, it had been there in the 19th century, but this way you get the suffragettes really actively trying to disrupt political meetings, throwing things at politicians, having verbal abuse and being thrown out of meetings, chaining themselves to railways, etc. So feminism was ongoing, and part of the debates around the First World War is that when the men went off to the front, many women took up their jobs. And for a long time, historians wondered to what extent did this help to bring about the Representation of the People Act in 1918, which enfranchised women over the age of 30 with a property qualification. This is the first act of some enfranchisement to some women. But I think they've pretty firmly established that that was going to come in anyway, and the First World War probably did very little to improve women's chances. Now, what might be important just to mention, and also in the context of one of the questions here, is what happens to women, but really this question of gender in the aftermath of 1920, so in the aftermath of the creation of Northern Ireland. And this is where you might see some similarities, both between Northern Ireland and what becomes the Irish Free State. both are effectively, well, small c conservative societies. And in fact, even though the Irish Free State enfranchises women much earlier than happens in Northern Ireland, which is then part of the UK, still women of all backgrounds are really gendered, and they're really forced into particular roles, and that shapes the character of both Northern Ireland and the Free State, which later on becomes the Republic, for the next 80 years, possibly a bit less, but I would say that's probably fairly fair. It's really only this century that in the Republic of Ireland, you have had significant movement in addressing women's issues, which is a sort of term, like it doesn't apply to anybody else other than women, but really thinking about issues regarding pay, employment, abortion, maternity leave, paternity leave. All these sorts of issues have been really part of radical politics this century, and then of course at the end of the 20th century too. Northern Ireland is slower, much slower on these issues, and these debates still are kind of very much shaping the society that materializes. So in some ways, actually, though partition is a very useful tool to explore differences both in different regions and how different groups experience it, in some way you can flip that over and say, well, actually the end result is quite similar for women, regardless if they're in Northern Ireland or then regardless if they were in the Irish Free State.
Great, thank you. Yes, very important to note. Let me do a couple of other questions I want to just kind of link together, because I know we're getting close to the end of our time. And one has to do with the movement of peoples and whether or not there was movement of Protestants from the three counties that found themselves in the Free State into Northern Ireland. We might also include whether Catholics or nationalists moved from Northern Ireland into the Free State. This movement of peoples, of course, is fundamentally important whenever there is a partition, and particularly when violence is associated with that borderland, which we, of course, see in the creation of Northern Ireland, just as we do in other parts of the world. So if maybe we could address that very briefly as well. I don't know, maybe Dara, if you want to try and take that up.
Sure, absolutely. So there are a couple of different questions there. I think it's important to recognize that this is a very fluid period. The events of 100 years ago, which created the modern states of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which we kind of see in James Craig's famous usage, the kind of the granite of Ulster, that they were kind of already set in stone. But of course, they were very fluid, and the events which Diane outlined earlier as well, the violent events, very, very often cause kind of at least short-term migration. So, for example, we have migrations of Catholics in particular in between 1920 and 1922 at the height of violence across to the south, especially during periods of sectarian tensions and so on. And this, of course, causes difficulties down south in terms of how do we accommodate Northern nationalists more broadly. So there's a degree of migrations because of localized violence and so on and so forth. And it's also important to note, and a lot of work has been done on this really, is that the census records on the island date from 1911 and then 1926. So that's a difference of 15 years. So there was a significant depopulation of Protestants in what became the Republic of Ireland. It was called Southern Ireland at the time. And of course, scholars are debating the nature of that migration. Was it of a voluntary nature in the sense of they didn't feel that they would be part of what became a Catholic state, essentially, especially under Eamon de Valera? Was it because of the violence of the revolutionary period, or indeed because of the First World War, in terms of enlistment rates and so on and so forth? So migrations were certainly part of, and Protestant migrations were certainly part of this period, and defined the experience of of Southern Unionists, and that's an important group that perhaps doesn't get the attention that Ulster Unionists do. Southern Unionists, of course, get left out, and Dan has mentioned this in part as well in this story, because they don't fit the kind of the logo that becomes Northern Ireland. They don't fit that northern provincial presentation. And so Unionists very often get written out of the story, and numerically as well, because they, again, between 1911 and 1926, there's a vacuum in the historical record. But as Diane stated, we are restoring some of those memories through the archive record, public record office of Northern Ireland, the Ulster Museum, notwithstanding institutions in the south. So.
Thank you. Yes, very, very. I mean, it's a critically important issue, and it actually relates to another question that was posed about the Government of Ireland Act and treatment of minorities, and whether or not the drafters of that were in fact thinking about anti-discriminatory elements in the legislation. Were they trying in any way to protect minorities in the two states that were being created by the Government of Ireland Act? I think the answer to that is yes, right? I mean, there were some elements, were there not? And I'll throw that to all three of you, really. So feel free to open up. Yeah, Diane first, maybe, and then Niamh.
I'll be super quick, Tim, because I know time is a little bit against us. Carson, interestingly, you know, in 21 was actually very concerned about Northern Ireland perhaps becoming, you know, this pro-Protestant state. And I think that is part of his decision to step aside. There are other things going on with him that I won't go into now in the interest of time, but certainly an awareness, and he obviously knew unionism very well and knew this Ulster brand of unionism, which had come so much to the fore, and was concerned by it, and saw the potential there for bias and discrimination, and you know, some of those other things that really sadly became, you know, a hallmark of the new state. But I'll pass to my colleagues.
Niamh, if you would.
So, yeah, just very briefly, I mean, the answer to that is yes, and this was done through proportional representation. And the new manner of voting in Northern Ireland at all levels is meant to be PR, but this is what got changed, transformed, changed, abolished in the 10 years that were to follow. So that, of course, grossly impacted on Catholics, and really this is part of the history of the first 10 years of Northern Ireland. They are the group, the most significant minority who really experience the changes and the transformations in these laws, and it affects them most politically. It also affects Labour MPs. So this is probably the chance when there were Labour MPs, there were Labour representatives who sought to stand. Any Labour or independent MPs who sought to stand on a sort of minority basis were immediately left out, because first past the post was never going to accept minority candidates. So really there were mechanisms that were enshrined to protect minorities, of whom Catholics were the largest group, but their abolition meant that there was therefore no protection, and there was no oversight then from Westminster to come back on that either. It was a done deal, and we know the consequences of that.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things, and I'm gonna try and draw us to a close because I know we're against the clock. There are so many good questions in the Q&A. And I'm sorry that we're not able to get to many of them. Certainly the kinds of transformations Niamh that was just talking about, doing away with proportional representation, had a profound impact, obviously, on the way that not only voting occurred, but representation occurred throughout the mid 20th century, and certainly played a role in spurring things like the civil rights movement of the 60s, I think in Northern Ireland. Ironically, the Irish Free State retained proportional representation, and that remains still a part of the political structure in the southern state, the Irish Republic, to this very day. But there are questions here about empire and connections to people in other parts of Europe as well that I wish we had time to get into. But I hope that our brief discussion, our all too brief discussion, has offered the audience some insights into the foundations of Northern Ireland and the long and complex history that went into shaping the foundations of the state 100 years ago. Let me ask each panelist if they have anything more they'd like to add here at the end. And on my behalf, just thank you so much for allowing this discussion to take place today, to our colleagues at American, Georgetown, and in the Northern Ireland Bureau. Dara, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just to echo your thanks to the organizers, but also to you, Tim, who is an expert in his own right on this period and on this subject. And I'm sure, Tim, we could go an hour just listening to you speaking on this subject. So maybe there's an opportunity for a sequel event in the future.
Thank you. Niamh?
This is very briefly, I think I want to echo that. Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure. My last little point on this is about empire, and actually the 1920 Act, which is partition, and then 1921, which is the treaty. Both of those keep Ireland within the empire. So in a way, you can see how central empire is to thinking of policymakers for both of those agreements, and indeed thereafter for solutions elsewhere. But thank you very much for allowing me to join. I've really enjoyed it.
Diane?
Again, I'll echo everyone's thanks. A really fascinating discussion. And just as Niamh's kind of emphasising the importance of empire, I'm perhaps predictably going to fly a flag for gender history, because to me, it's one of the most fascinating areas that is really starting to emerge. And I think is causing a very significant revision in what we have considered to be, Ireland's revolutionary period, the establishment of Northern Ireland and so on. So a gendered lens, I think, can be really revealing, but thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you to the organizers and to my great fellow panelists. We'll turn it back over to Central Action in Washington.
Good afternoon, everybody from Washington, D.C. I'm Colleen Parsons, and I direct the Global Irish Studies Initiative at Georgetown University. We are a co-host of this conference along with the School of Public Affairs and the School of International Service at American University, and with our friends at the Northern Ireland Bureau and the Washington Ireland Program. We at Georgetown are honored, we're delighted to be working alongside our colleagues, and we're very grateful. This is really important. We're very grateful to American University for all their technical support for actually putting on this webinar and holding us all together in one virtual room. Many thanks to Tim McMahon, Professor McMahon from Marquette University, and to all of our panelists in the first panel for really fascinating discussion about all of the sort of swirling possibilities, in a sense, in the early 1920s at the formation of the state. So while we spent our first hour or so thinking about the contexts of 1921, and especially their global contexts, we're going to move now in the second hour to a panel that will think about the present moment in Northern Ireland, the challenges, the opportunities, and the realities of 2021. And we have a distinguished panel here to help us think about our current moment. I know we have some difficulty with a couple of panelists joining us, but we hope they'll be able to get into the room within a few seconds. The panel is, we have 5 panelists. The Right Honourable Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is a Member of Parliament in Westminster for Lagan Valley and leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. He's also previously served in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Alongside him will be Mr. John Finucane, a lawyer and a Member of Parliament in Westminster for the constituency of North Belfast, representing Sinn Féin, and also former Lord Mayor of Belfast. We also have Mike Nesbitt, Mr. Mike Nesbitt, a member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland for Strangford, and a member of the Ulster Unionist Party and a former leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, as well as Ms. Claire Hanna, who is a member of Parliament in Westminster for Belfast South, representing the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, and has previously served in the Northern Ireland Assembly. We had hoped to be joined by Minister Naomi Long, Minister for Justice in Northern Ireland, but she's had to bow out at the very, very, very last minute. Our sincere thanks then to Ms. Patricia O'Lynn, who has agreed to join us instead of Minister Long. Ms. O'Lynn is a councillor on the Mid and East Antrim Borough Council representing the Alliance Party, and she's also a special advisor in the Justice Department to Minister Long. The panel will be moderated by my co-hosts, and I'm extremely grateful to my 2 co-hosts of this conference, Dr. Kimberly Cowell-Myers, Associate Professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Kimberly is the author of Religion and Politics in the 19th Century, The Party Faithful in Ireland and Germany. And it will also be moderated by Dr. Carol Gallagher, who's a professor and senior associate dean in the School of International Service at American University and author of, among other things, After the Peace, Loyalist Paramilitaries in Post-Accord Northern Ireland. It's my pleasure to hand over to Carolyn and to Kimberly to get this panel underway. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all of our panelists coming to us from Northern Ireland. I know it's dinner time, so I appreciate you taking some time away from your food to be here with us today. So as Glenn said, Kimberly and I are going to co-moderate this panel, and we hope that the other 2 will be able to join us momentarily. We're going to do back and forth questions, and we're going to use a round robin format. So we'll ask a question, and we'll just move through the panelists, hopefully in alphabetical order if everybody gets here. And we're going to start with climate change. With the ongoing COP26 conference, climate change is in the news a lot today. One of the priorities of the reformed executive in the New Decade New Approach Agreement was emissions cuts. However, Northern Ireland is the only one of UK's 3 devolved parliaments not to have adopted these targets. What does your party prioritize in addressing climate change, and how does this make you different from other parties? And I think we can start with you, John Finucane.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you very much to the university for putting on this phase of the conference. I was fortunate enough to listen into the first section, and it was excellent. So I'm really delighted that we're able to host this section of it as well. In relation to climate change, it's obviously a very pertinent and timely question, given the week that's in it. We've had world leaders and everybody descending onto Scotland to discuss this. I think it's something that has obviously been to the forefront of, I think, the majority of political parties' minds here. Whenever the local assembly was restored at the beginning of last year, there was a commitment under that political agreement, New Decade, New Approach, to, I think, really take this on. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. It would be certainly my party's view that the minister who has the responsibility for that has taken too long. I think civic leaders, progressive parties, I think everybody in society wants to see fairly simple targets identified. We need to, I think, move towards a net zero society, and we need legislation for that. I think it's certainly not something to be proud of that from Stormont we see an absence of legislation. In respect of my own party, we are an all-island party, and I think that whenever we talk about climate, it is one of many very good examples where a joined-up all-island approach is not just common sense, but it's also really necessary. Similar to COVID, the climate emergency does not respect borders, and I think to have two jurisdictions on the one island that does not have a joined-up approach in how we deal with our climate is something that future generations will pay the price for. So it's incumbent, I think, that we do approach it in that manner, because we already see examples of that, whether it's flooding either here in Ireland or certainly in Europe. We see the outworkings of climate change, and I think it's an issue that more and more we see that mobilisation, particularly of our youth. On Saturday past, we had rallies in Belfast and Derry that were attended, certainly by, I think, all political parties were represented. But the amount of people that were on the streets for that, I think, certainly puts it into perspective. Other issues that we may talk about this evening with regards what is a priority for people looking forward.
Thank you. Claire Hannah.
What did you say? Sorry.
I just said, would you like to respond to the question about the emissions and about climate?
Me?
Yes.
Sorry, I just wasn't clear. Yes, I mean, I think as John has outlined, the Assembly in Northern Ireland is a laggard in this. It doesn't have any binding legislation. It doesn't have an environmental protection agency, and it doesn't really have a plan. And I think that's a consequence of the politics, but also, I suppose, the up-down nature and just the kind of stopping and starting of governance over the last 2 decades. For the SDLP's part, we're kind of doing what we can where we can at city council level. Our councillors are trying to embed a kind of a future generation model into planning decisions, so that in the same way as we audit for, say, good relations or financial competence, when we're making a big decision, that we look at the impact on the climate and sustainability. In the Assembly, obviously, we're co-sponsors to the cross-party climate bill, and here in Westminster, I'm vice chair of the Green New Deal group and co-sponsoring with the Green Party a Green New Deal bill here, which we think is about one of the most ambitious pieces of legislation in the world, but it is urgent, and I think Northern Ireland saying, "Oh, we've our own dysfunction to deal with," isn't sufficient anymore, because we know it is already affecting people. This isn't a new problem. 10 years ago, I worked in overseas development in countries around the world, and in a campaigning group that was lobbying the Assembly to take action on this issue. So there isn't really an excuse for the delay. And with each year that passes, and as the evidence gets stronger, the solutions do too. And I think it is easy for people to panic and lose a lot of hope in climate, because it is so overwhelming. But really, some of the technologies that can help us decarbonize have really come of age in recent years. So the solutions are there, and the sooner we go for them, the more cost effective they'll be.
Thank you. Mike Nesbitt?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this evening, and I look forward to joining Kimberly live in DC early next month. Can I also say hi to Claire and John? I always enjoy debating with them, because we search out areas of agreement, and where we can't agree, we can disagree agreeably, and I think that's the way politics should be. John and Claire represent the great city of Belfast. I represent a more rural area called Strangford, which is built around a loch and the Ards Peninsula. And I'm proud to, a few years ago, to have been a founding member of the Ards Peninsula Coastal Erosion Group, reflecting concern from the people who live on the peninsula about the effect, particularly of rising tides and erosion on their community, and we're being credited with good work, not least reducing the number of government bodies, agencies and departments who have an interest in the coast from 5 to 2. The next step is to get a lead department, because unless you've got somebody who's being told you're in charge of driving this, you don't get the action you want. So, for example, we have a great stately home called Mount Stewart, right on the edge of the loch. The gardens are always globally rated, like in the top 20 in the world. And there's a great concern if the tide comes up that the gardens will be lost. So they're currently looking at ways of actually moving the garden by taking cuttings and moving the gardens to the other side of the building, up the hill, so they're safe. So, you know, the issues are all there. And in terms of action, I mean, I've been at Stormont as an MLA for 10 years. This is the first time we've seen 2 bills on the one subject, one from the minister, one from a private member. They have to come together. They have to come together and get it into one bill. The important thing with just a few months left in our mandate is that we get away from this fact that we're the only devolved institutions without a climate act. We've got to get an act. And to do that, I don't think we should get hung up on the targets. You know, you can have targets for 2030, 2045, 2050. Things will change, not least technology, between now and then. How we deliver energy will evolve over the next couple of decades. So the important thing is, can we get a target? Can we get an act that we agree on? Don't get hung up on the detail to the point where that actually stops you going through the lobbies to support an act.
Thank you. Camilla, you want to take the next question?
I do. I just want to mention that Dr. Patricia Lynn is with us. She's in the audience. We're having some technical trouble moving her over, and I'm going to make her a solemn pledge that when she does get here, we'll make sure to ask her her favorite question, which is on climate change. But I have some questions lined up to ask our panelists about the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. There's a lot of talk about the need to protect the Good Friday Agreement, and some talk that recent policies and actions by different actors threaten to undermine it. I would like to ask each of the panelists, what do you see as the agreement's strengths? And if there was one thing you would change about the agreement, what that might be. So I'm going to run in alphabetical order, just as Carol did, and ask Mr. John Finucane first.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I'm always reluctant to indulge in hyperbole, especially when we're having debates and discussions like this, but I think that we can never underestimate the power of the Good Friday Agreement. I think the agreement that was made in 1998 quite literally saved lives with regards to the time period that followed. I think it recognised that there was a necessity to have an agreement which represented the reality of society on this island, and that is that there must essentially be a rights-based society to allow everybody who calls this place home, whether they identify as Irish or British or neither, that is reflected so that society can truly prosper. And I think that it was a huge success, and I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that it would not have been possible had it been left to us and us alone. I think the importance of the role, particularly of your own country in the United States, again, can't be overstated. It was crucial, I think, in helping to form relations and relationships in the build-up to 1998, but most importantly, I think it has acted as a guarantor of our peace agreement. I think it's one of the proudest moments, certainly, of Bill Clinton's foreign policy at that time, and I think it remains a priority for the United States, subsequent United States administrations. We are obviously living in a time where the political debate is dominated by Brexit, and since 2016, I think what has been of particular reassurance to people here is that not only have the European Union recognised the threat to the Good Friday Agreement that Brexit poses, but I think importantly as well, the United States has recognised that, and that's been recognised in the commentary of congressmen and women, of senators, of powerful committees, and indeed of subsequent presidents themselves. So I think that ensuring that the Good Friday Agreement is protected in all its forms remains a challenge for everybody, both domestically and internationally. And I think that if there is one thing that needs to be focused on, it's the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years on. We still don't have that agreement implemented in full. And I think it's important that people recognise the society that we live in today, the society that we want to create for the future. And the Good Friday Agreement represents that template as to how we can achieve that permanent peace and the ability to offer prosperity for future generations.
Thank you. Claire Hannah?
Yeah, I suppose I like a lot about it, just the values and the principles and the fact that it does always encourage us to look to the future. And I suppose the fact that it acknowledges the differences in aspiration and identity of people here. And at its core, the fact that victories aren't solutions. There isn't really an outcome for Northern Ireland, with one side triumphing, and the Good Friday Agreement is essentially about relationships and a framework for managing those competing desires and competing identities, and even for consenting and agreeing to disagree, and including on the things that aren't your number one preference. It's just a way of facilitating give and take, and it's important that and it is talked about. And I don't know how familiar people are with the comedy show Only Fools and Horses, but I always think of it whenever people are talking about the Good Friday Agreement, when Del Boy used to say to Rodney, when he was trying to get him to do something, he would say, "Rodney, on our deathbed, our mum said," and then he would go into what he was going to say. And people do that with the Good Friday Agreement all the time. They use it to stand up the point that they wanted to make, no matter how diverse those points are. But as I say, it is a framework that allows us to do those things, and it has the potential to evolve. It isn't just an ornament that we go, "Isn't that lovely?" And we did that in 1998. It has the potential to grow new bodies, and, for example, to beef up the East-West and the Strand 3 components now that Brexit is challenging those. In terms of bits I don't like, I do think it could evolve a little bit with the way society has evolved. And I've said this before, that the way it is presently being operated, and I think there are people, some people who are operating it because it's the law and they have to operate it, rather than really feeling it and wanting to share power for the good of everybody in the community. But some of the things around, for example, designation, are risking locking in sectarianism when they're kind of making people define and identify only in that way. The fact is, fewer and fewer times are we falling back on people's designation, but I think there's room for the agreement and the Strand 1, as in the Northern Ireland Assembly institutions, to evolve a little bit, as they did 3 or 4 years ago in the creation of an official opposition. Basically, it isn't the system isn't delivering particularly good outcomes. It isn't facilitating, or it isn't encouraging compromise, and it is appropriate that we look at how it can do that better. But basically, it is about relationships. It is about agreeing and disagreeing honourably, and about the ways that we facilitate that in a place that's still very, very divided.
Thank you, Claire Hannah. May I ask Mike Nesbitt, and then I'll go to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, and also to Tricia Lynn, who's joined us. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly, and I also welcome Patricia and Geoffrey to the call. The thing I like most about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is what you read on page 1, the declaration of support, because all the participants agreed that this was an opportunity for a fresh start in building relationships. And politics is about relationships. And what the Declaration of Support says is, we are going to build new relationships based on tolerance of each other, based on reconciliation, based on building trust, and offering each other mutual respect. And those are absolutely core values to a consociational form of government, which is what we have at Stormont. And whatever about 100 years ago and how Northern Ireland came to be, today in 2021, you have got British loyalists and unionists, Irish nationalists and Republicans, and those who wish to be described as none of the above. Nobody's going away. We can get cryogenically frozen for 5, 15, 50 years. When we emerge, those groups will still be populating this little postage stamp on the world map. Nobody owns it anymore. No group is a majority. So we have to learn to get along. And as a broadcast journalist for many years, I interviewed the late John Hume many times. And while others were talking about the problem of division, he was talking up the beauty of diversity. And we still haven't totally plugged in to the value of a diverse society and what that offers, because humanity is diverse. And I think the Belfast Agreement tried to recognize that. As Claire said, in terms of identity, it was saying you can be British, you can be Irish, you can be both. But really importantly, there's no hierarchy. Being British isn't better than being Irish. And that, I'm afraid, is the problem with Brexit. And for those unionists who supported Brexit, I really regret they didn't think this through, that it was very important to many people to say, my identity is Irish and European, which is what bonds me to the people on the other side of the border in the Republic of Ireland. And the Belfast Agreement said, only you define your identity. And yet they felt that back in 2016 with the referendum, which led to Brexit, that it was English nationalists coming in over their heads, breaking that bond. And while we focus on borders, on trade and tariff, which are all very important, we should not ignore the fact that this has done huge damage to people's sense of identity. So would I change anything about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? No, I wouldn't, because it was endorsed by referendum by the people. And it's already been changed, not least at St. Andrews in 2006. And I think those changes have been disastrous and are coming back to bite us. So no, I wouldn't change the Belfast Agreement, although I accept Claire's proposition that the danger is we get locked into that kind of Protestant Catholic Unionist Nationalist designation for all time. And that is evolving organically and naturally among our people.
Thank you, Mike Nesbitt. Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, thank you for joining us today. The question I had asked to the panelists was, what are the strengths of the Good Friday Agreement? And then if there is one thing you would change, what would that be?
Well, good evening, everyone. I think at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement is a very delicate constitutional balance. And I think that at the moment, that constitutional balance has been harmed by something called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has created a difficulty in terms of respecting Northern Ireland's relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom. The Good Friday Agreement in Article 1 states very clearly that Northern Ireland will remain an integral part of the United Kingdom unless and until a majority of the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise. The High Court in Belfast recently ruled that the Northern Ireland Protocol has changed the nature of the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain in trading terms. And therefore, I think that has created a major problem. There isn't a single unionist elected representative that supports the protocol. And therefore, I think that we need to address that issue and correct the imbalance that has now arisen in terms of the constitutional arrangements that arise from the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that is a continuing area of challenge. In respect of what I would change, I differ from Mike. Over 20 years later, we have scores of innocent victims in Northern Ireland who've never had justice. The Good Friday Agreement was a massive missed opportunity to do something for those victims. After all, they were the people who suffered the most during our 30 years of conflict. I think it was a major mistake not to deal with that issue comprehensively in the Good Friday Agreement. And now we are faced with the prospect of an outcome on legacy, on justice, which will mean that innocent victims no longer have access to justice, which would, in my opinion, be a major diminution of their rights. And I think that is a major failing of the Good Friday Agreement, that it didn't adequately address the rights of victims. It certainly addressed the rights of perpetrators. It opened the doors of our prisons and allowed people who had committed, in some cases, multiple murders to walk free, and really did nothing by way of recompense, by way of recognition, by way of a proper agreed process for the victims of the Troubles. And I think it is a major shortfall of the Good Friday Agreement that it so spectacularly failed those who had suffered the greatest during our troubled past. And now the consequence of that is the prospect that for many of those victims, justice will never come because it is to be denied to them. And I think peace without justice is a peace that is diminished. And therefore, I think this is a major flaw in the agreement that should have been dealt with at the time. And unfortunately and sadly, political expediency meant that it wasn't.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey Donaldson. Patricia, Dr. Patricia Lynn, thank you for joining us, especially given all the tech challenges you had getting here. So we'll give you an opportunity to answer that question of what do you see as the Good Friday Agreement strengths and what would you change if you could?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Kimberly and Caroline, first of all, for having me here. And again, sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm from a part of Northern Ireland called Larne, which is known to be somewhat isolated from civilization. So I'm sure some of my colleagues here are smirking in the background, so forgive me for that. Yeah, in terms of that question, it's a really interesting one that's been answered really well by the majority of panelists. What I want to say about the Good Friday Agreement primarily is I find it very difficult to criticize it or comment on it because I was in primary 7 elementary school at the time whenever it was being developed. I think it's one of the most complex and tricky agreements that's ever been negotiated. And personally, I grew up viewing it as the ultimate concord of citizenship that embodied values of reconciliation, peace, tolerance. It enabled humongous acts of grace and peace to be displayed. And as a child growing up in Northern Ireland at that time, it really restored my faith in humanity, my family's faith in humanity. And as some of my colleagues have said, it really lit the way forward for us trying to move through, which was a dark time. The agreement isn't perfect, as we all know. I think some of the challenges of it are that although it focused on rights, it also reminded us of our responsibilities. It's an agreement about citizenship that doesn't prioritise one nationality over another. But I think that the problem that we have is whenever people start to abuse the agreement and use it as a bit of a battering tool and don't operate within the authenticity of what it was designed to achieve, we're into dangerous waters. One of the things that I would change about it, if I could, is probably the requirement to engage in mandatory coalition. I think it was necessary at the time, but moving forward, I think there's many people here, elected representatives, that could form a coalition of the willing that could take things forward into the next stage, that could allow the agreement to evolve and to be implemented in modern society in a way that it no longer is all of the time. So if I had one ask, it would be that we would potentially change that tiny little aspect of the agreement.
Thank you. We're going to move on to another question, which is dealing with the past in the present. And I think, Sir Jeffrey, you hinted at this in your last response. In July, the British government, as you all know, published a command paper outlining its intention to prohibit future prosecutions of military veterans and ex-paramilitaries for Troubles incidents predating April 1998. But many political parties and victims groups in Northern Ireland have objected to these proposals. My question to you all is there a better approach? And if so, what are the principles that should underline and be informing a new approach? And we can start in alphabetical order with Sir Jeffrey Donaldson.
Well, thank you. I think that a better approach is to enable people to have access to justice. And where there is new and compelling evidence that emerges in a case, then I think it is right that victims should have the opportunity to take their case through the justice process. And I think it is wrong to deny them that opportunity. So I think that we need to get agreement on a process that keeps open the route to justice. I think any process should be victim focused. I think it should be a matter for families to decide and not the state if they wish to pursue justice for their loved ones. There are others who will want to pursue information or truth about what happened. I'm afraid I'm a bit skeptical about the extent to which perpetrators will be forthcoming with truth. But nevertheless, it's an option to be explored. But I think central to any proposal must be that the route to justice is not closed off. I think the challenge for all of us is, how do we move this process to the next stage beyond dealing with legacy to one of reconciliation and healing in Northern Ireland? And I'm just not convinced that closing off the path to justice makes reconciliation easier. I think it has the opposite effect. So if the government are genuine about moving Northern Ireland forward and moving to the next stage, which involves reconciliation and healing in Northern Ireland, then I think there has to be an agreed process that continues to give people the opportunity to pursue justice where there is evidence that could lead to a conviction.
Thank you. John Finucane.
Thank you. And I think it's worth saying, at the risk of coming across as pedantic, that it's not just many political parties and victims groups, it's all. This is a very rare example where you can point to one issue uniting people right across certainly the political spectrum, the civic spectrum, the religious spectrum, and I think most importantly, those who have been directly impacted by the conflict here. Jeffrey touched on criminal prosecutions, and that's important. But what this command paper in July signalled was an attack on the rule of law that goes way beyond just criminal prosecutions. So it would essentially wipe out any family's ability to have civil remedies, as well as the criminal justice system taking its own course. It would prevent our police ombudsman, which was a vital body that was set up to administer and oversee police reform here, as well as preventing families having the very basic right of an inquest. Some families have waited 50 years, continue to wait 50 years, and other families, irrespective of who the perpetrator is that has resulted in the loss of their loved one, they will be affected and impacted exactly the same. And what the British government unilaterally outlined in July, I think, has a particular cruelty attached to it, because it prevents families from accessing information. And we have seen multiple examples, even in recent times, where that cathartic effect of families getting answers has not just on them, but the communities that suffered as well. And I think as a recent example, the Ballymurphy inquest, which issued its findings earlier on this year, which held that all of those who were killed over a couple of days in West Belfast in the early 1970s were entirely innocent. Now, that didn't just impact the families, that impacted that entire community as well. And what the British government are doing actually goes further than what General Pinochet did in Chile. Their Pinochet allowed civil remedies. Pinochet didn't impact on ongoing prosecutions. And we await the legislation, which I think people suspect will be published imminently. But I think I would agree with Jeffrey again that if this goes through as per the command paper, I think it will have an impact on families that will seep down generationally. How can you talk about reconciliation when people aren't exactly clear what they're reconciling with and who they're reconciling with? And whilst dealing with our past is difficult, it's also necessary. And it's also something that can be done parallel to the day-to-day politics and the progress that all parties want to make. That the two concepts aren't mutually exclusive. It has, I think, drawn the attention. We talked earlier about the importance of the United States, and I think it has drawn the adverse attention of President Biden's administration, and again, many other senators and congresspersons. It's also, I think, been the subject of academic scrutiny and within the United Nations and that human rights world, as well as the families themselves, that they all are very keenly awaiting to see what will be in this legislation, because I don't think it takes a lawyer or a genius to really work out that this is going to be bogged up in the courts for a considerable period of time. And whilst that happens, family members are dying, family members are getting older, and they are doing that whilst not finding out truth about what happened to their loved one, and they certainly aren't getting justice. So it's to be condemned what these proposals are, and I'm glad to see that there is such uniform opposition to it.
Who do you want to answer next? Sorry.
Sorry, I think it's Claire. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Claire.
okay, great. Thanks very much. There's a lot to agree with what Jeffrey and John said. And look, legacy and the past is like a fog over everything we do in the present, and nobody would deny that it needs to be solved. But in terms of the current proposals, this ain't it. Basically, the best effort we had so far was the Stormont House agreement, which was agreed by nearly all of the parties and the two governments, and in the main by victims groups. I mean, a lot of dissent from that, but I think the worrying thing is that each time it gets renegotiated, it gets watered down, and what good outcomes there are from victims get diminished. The impression is given by some, including the UK government, that yeah, but we don't have that, we're not implementing that because it doesn't work. It hasn't been allowed to work, and many of the pieces of infrastructure have not been implemented or funded. You asked what the principle should be, and it should be truth, recovery, and the needs of victims, because currently the process serves the needs of victim makers. It is about sparing the embarrassment of people in uniform and out of uniform who did grotesque and sectarian things during a very dirty war. And this is about those perpetrators, as I say, paramilitaries and state actors, essentially covering up for each other, blaming one another for the truth not emerging, and all the while victims paying the price. And it isn't, I mean, people talk about the fact that the information hasn't come out like it's some natural phenomena. It hasn't come out because it has been actively suppressed, and quite simply that won't work for society. If you look at other places that have tried to just not talk about it and move along, ultimately, whether it takes a generation or two, people will want to know what happened to their family member. And as John and Jeffrey said, there are people who have a date for their case or their trial or their inquest proceeding. So just to put the guillotine down in that way would be particularly inhumane. But it's just the principle that if you close the door, the blood will keep coming under it, as somebody very viscerally said. The other thing that in terms of a principle for it, and if there's one thing that maybe the Good Friday Agreement does have a deficit, is that it wasn't the covenant of non-violence that many of us would like it to be. I think the vast majority of people who voted for it believe that violence should not ever or in the future be used as a political tactic. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of people who say that violence is an acceptable political tactic, just not right now. And as we enter a very turbulent period, again, constitutionally and for all sorts of reasons, retrospectively legalizing murder as part of a political campaign would send a really, really dangerous message. So yes, I agree with John and Jeffrey. This command paper is so far away from the rule of law and the ethos and the values of the Good Friday Agreement. It's hard to capture it, but the principle needs to be truth, recovery, the needs of victims, and not the needs of the victim makers.
Thank you, Claire. Sorry. What's your take on this?
Well, I come to this with a bit of background, a bit of baggage, if you like. First of all, I was a victims commissioner before I joined politics. And secondly, my interest in politics and in conflict goes back to January 1973, when the family business was blowing up. My father was 49 years of age at the time. And in that instant, every certainty in his life disappeared, but every responsibility remained. Still had a wife, 3 young children, car, house, the whole 9 yards. And I also want to acknowledge that that is as nothing to the pain and the baggage that John Finucane is carrying since his father was so brutally murdered. And that is the problem. So many of us in this country are carrying that baggage, and we have to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is not an amnesty. So I was at an event recently and spoke to a very senior member of the UK government, of the British cabinet. And I said to him, would you go and face one of your constituents in a constituency in England who had lost a loved one to murder and look them in the eye and say, I deny you your right to justice? And he basically said, Northern Ireland was different. The conflict was different. Basically, he said, suck it up. Well, I'm not prepared to suck it up, and victims should not be prepared to suck it up. In terms of truth and justice, they're not stupid. They know that the chances of seeing somebody taken to court, convicted, and put in prison could be 1,000,000 to 1. It could be 10,000,000 to 1. But I asked the audience, go and Google a man called John Proctor, a young RUC officer, who in 1981, I think, went to see his wife and newborn baby in the Mid-Ulster Hospital. He was shot dead in the car park as he was leaving. 32 years later, a man was convicted of that murder. I will not deny the right of a victim to hope that they are the next Proctor family who will see justice. So it is just entirely wrong to do what the government are proposing to do. And the other thought I would give you is, having had that insight, deep insight, and often horrible insight as a victims commissioner, listening to the stories of the victims and survivors of a conflict. There was a common theme, which was you would have thought the day you became a conflict, the state and the agencies of the state would form the wagons in a circle around you. So if you needed your children taken to school the next day, it would be done. If you needed somebody to do your grocery shopping, it would be done. If you needed a few quid, it would be provided. The common experience was quite the opposite. So while I absolutely accept for those who want truth and justice, they must have that route left open to them, as well as lost lives, we can do a lot more in terms of addressing the lost opportunities for the living, in terms of the lost opportunities in education, employment, housing, health, particularly mental health. And it's not just for them now, it's not just for their children. It's got to the stage where it's for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that's an area where we can make a difference. And unfortunately, in all the talks we've had from, Haas, O'Sullivan, Stormont House, we have this policy, nothing's agreed until everything is agreed. But we could agree that, for example, the mental health of victims and survivors is an issue we could treat discreetly, and we would make a difference.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. Yeah, I think, the recent unilateral action from the UK government is just deeply disappointing, deeply hurtful. I am always highly cognizant of whenever we're talking about issues to do with legacy, particularly this issue, that every time it is brought up in such a flamboyant, flagrant way with this unilateral action that's taken place, we have the potential to re-traumatize victims. And it's just something that none of us wants. It's on the call. So in terms of an approach, we all agree that any approach going forward has to be victim-centered, but we also have to acknowledge that victims are not a homogenous group, and justice comes for people in many, many different forms. I know Jeffrey made reference there to reconciliation, and in ways I agree with him, but the principles of reconciliation are first political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency. I don't know how we force people into reconciliation when we're dealing with parties who are coming to the table in an inauthentic way that have broken trust. And it's not as if we're dealing with small issues here. We're dealing with people's lives, with their families' lives, with deeply emotive issues. And I cannot sit here and say that if my family member was murdered, their life was taken, they were shot, whatever way you want to put it, that I would want to engage in reconciliation. I'm fairly confident that I would want traditional justice through the court process. And so I and the Alliance Party and the majority of people in this call, all of them, agree that any process has to be first and foremost victim-centered, but also Article 2 compliant. And in terms of a better approach, usually, you know, with things to do with the Stormont House Agreement, I would struggle to come up with a better approach. I think it can evolve. There's parts that can be added to it. But in this instance, I don't. A better approach would be to cease the lack of, the inauthentic action, the unilateral action that's taken place by the UK government, and to revert to what was agreed, and to do so in an authentic way with the needs of all victims at the centre of the process going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, so we wanted to ask some questions about the role for the US. Many people in the US are very concerned, very interested in what happens in Northern Ireland, and particularly concerned to see a peaceful and prosperous future for all people there. So I'm going to ask you a double-barreled question. And again, because the hour is getting ahead of us, we'll go in alphabetical order, but I'll ask you to be brief in your answers. What are the places where you see a role for the US in the future? And then how important do you think it is that the Northern Ireland Executive have an outward-looking focus to its work, representing its work here in Washington, for example? So in alphabetical order, that takes us to you, John Finucane, if you don't mind. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I can't seem to remember my alphabet. That's actually Jeffrey Donaldson first. So Jeffrey, would you mind? Alphabet is hard,
Sure.
everybody.
Thank you. I mean, the United States has had an interest in the peace process in Northern Ireland for many years. And I think that what is important in terms of that interest is that it is balanced, that it recognizes that protecting the Good Friday Agreement is not a one-sided thing, that an agreement is an agreement between two sides. And that Mike and I represent the unionist side of that agreement. And I think sometimes American administrations lose sight of the fact that the Good Friday Agreement is not an agreement that relates only to one party or one side in Northern Ireland. And I would like to see a more balanced approach taken by the US administration in its dealings with Northern Ireland. I think it would be more influential if it did that. Of course, we want to see, for example, the potential of greater cooperation with the United States in terms of investment. And that's not just, we're not talking here about handouts. We're not talking about charity. We're talking about American companies seeing the opportunities of investing in Northern Ireland. And that is an area where I think we can do more work to attract American investment into Northern Ireland. We've a great workforce. We have a highly skilled, highly educated workforce. And I think this is an area where we can exploit even more opportunities there. And of course, both unionists and nationalists and others in Northern Ireland have a strong affinity to the United States. When you consider that some 50 million people in America have Irish or Ulster Scots ancestry, about half of them from a Catholic Irish background, about half of them from a Protestant Irish background. And so I think there is a huge diaspora there that has an interest in Northern Ireland, and that is something that I'm keen to see develop as we move forward. And I think the American administration can be an encourager for peace. It can certainly help in building the prosperity that goes hand in hand with peace in Northern Ireland through investment. And I think, as I've said, it's important that its interest in Northern Ireland is balanced and recognises that there's more than one perspective to be taken into account.
Great, thank you. Now, John Finucane, please.
Thank you. I think we've already touched this evening on some of the areas in which America has been very important and crucial, integral. I think we talked about the Good Friday Agreement itself. I would include legacy in that. I mean, I've testified at numerous hearings in Washington, D.C. because America has had that foreign policy interest, that human rights interest in how we address and deal with our past. But I think that we can always come back and focus on what is the most pressing issue of the day. And I referenced this earlier on, and that since 2016 has been Brexit. And Brexit obviously was a political ideal that was born out of English nationalism, but wasn't voted for by the majority of people here. And I have to challenge the assertion of Jeffrey earlier on, where he says that the protocol, basically the mitigation, the vehicle which is designed to protect us from Brexit, that would affect the constitutional identity and the constitutional balance that is contained within the Good Friday Agreement. That's quite simply nonsense. And I don't use that term lightly. And I think that is deservedly called out and justifiably called out by American politicians and the American administration, because Brexit in its truest form presented a real threat to stability of structures on this island. It presented a threat to the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that America has been very strong in standing up for the Good Friday Agreement since the Brexit referendum. And it has continued to be very strong since the agreement designed to mitigate the worst impacts of Brexit was entered into between the British government and the European Union at the end of last year. Now, what we have witnessed this year is a British government essentially trying to unilaterally walk away from the agreement that they signed up to. And if we are serious and if we are honest about trying to bring investment onto this island, then the protocol represents an opportunity for American companies, international companies, to have access to a market of 450 million people in the European Union, as well as having access to a market in the United Kingdom as well. We are the envy of so many jurisdictions around the world, because without having to pay a penny, we have dual access to both markets. And the amount of economic interest by companies who actually are inquiring about setting up here is something that should be welcomed. It shouldn't be weaponized. And I think if we are serious about continuing and allowing our relationship with America to flourish, then we need to be honest about the political situation that we created and that we find ourselves in at the minute. So I think that the American influence in our process here is real, it's necessary, and I see it being ongoing for quite some time.
Okay, thank you. Claire, Hannah?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think, yes, a combination of stewardship and influence and the economy. And that was at the heart of the Hume strategy, really, that kind of got us towards the Good Friday Agreement. As he said, if you have a big problem, make it bigger. And he internationalized it, and he used the influence of America to help get the governments, the Irish government and the UK government and Europe as well, in the right place to facilitate it. I do share some of the concerns at the moment. The UK's foreign policy and other can basically summed up as nobody tells us what to do. So it's difficult to maybe bring some of that influence to bear. And I will concur with a lot of what John said there about Brexit and the protocol, that the fundamental model at the heart of those most aggressively opposed to the protocol is that it can't stand because it doesn't have consent, but yet they are seeking a very hard Brexit that demonstrably has no consent at all. So as I say, the investment and following through on that unique dual market access that we have, when we are allowed to capitalise on it, because at the moment we know that investors don't want to come near a place where buses are going on fire and the government isn't very stable and so on. But as John Hume also regularly said, the best peace process is a job, and that was at the heart of seeking that investment from US companies over many years, giving people decent employment and a reason to get up in the morning. But it is just a fact that having a foot in both of those markets, being at the hinge of the UK and the EU single markets, is both as I say, an economic unique selling point. And if people have the vision to see it, actually, a seller for the union, because it offers market access that actually Northern Ireland wouldn't have in the event of a new Ireland. So it is a classic missed opportunity for people to be trying to denigrate it. Never mind the fact that it does broadly, while nobody loves it, it does broadly have the support of people, because they realise that we need protected from the very hard Brexit that the UK got. But as I say, I think people in the main are very grateful for the continued interest of friends and allies from across political parties in the US, and that will continue to be important. We're very, very lucky as a region in terms of the hand holding we have had. There are many places emerging from conflict that haven't had the same level of emotional and political and economic support that Northern Ireland has, and I'm sure at times people wonder when we're ever going to embrace and grab those opportunities, but I know it's something that people welcome.
Thank you. I am aware we have just a few moments left before the top of the hour, and we need to hear yet from Mike Nesbitt and also from Tricia Lynn. So Mike, would you please?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you a party political answer, and I'm going to flip your question. Not what can America do for us, what can we do for America? And it is engage, because as a broadcast journalist, I covered Gerry Adams's first visit in 1994, the conference by the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And the two unionist leaders of the day reacted in two ways. They cancelled their appearance at the conference, which I could understand. They cancelled their flights, strategically bonkers. You need to go and explain. Nobody's going to put the unionist case bar the unionists. And that's why later this month, I'm scheduling a visit for my party leader, Doug Beattie, will be in New York, and then we'll be down with you in DC. You've got to engage, explain. Nobody else is going to do it for you.
Thank you. And Trish, I'm going to allow you to give a double-barreled answer because you have this one on the US role and the Northern Ireland executive, and you also have one lingering yet, which I had promised to allow you to attend to on the environment.
Okay, so I think in terms of US-NI relations, it's quite an interesting question. I'm always really cognizant that whenever people from Northern Ireland elected representatives talk about the relations that we're talking about, dual market access, that we're talking about investment, we're talking about the things the US can do for us. From a structural perspective, I think one of the last things the UK government cares about is their reputation on the international stage. So if we want to see people behaving in politics in a way that's appropriate, we need to pro-socially model the behavior that we want them to see. So when President Trump was elected, whether or not you are in favor of him, we did see a lot heightened visceralness, we would say, in the political sphere. So I think to continue for leaders in America to behave in an appropriate and moral way would be really advantageous to us. But again, getting back to that point in terms of what we can do for America, at a cultural and personal level, I think practical things that Americans can do is not underestimate the influence that they can have on the people of Northern Ireland in general. I participated in two programs as a student. One's the Project Children project, where I got to live in America for a couple of months, and then again the Washington Ireland project, where I interned with Senator John McCain. Both of those projects completely changed my life. They broadened my horizons. They expanded my understanding of binary divisions in politics and introduced me to a melting pot of people from loads of different ethnicities, races, backgrounds, and also exposed me to their different ways of life, how to live with them and to find ways to connect. And the cultural diversity of America and those programs enabled me to come home empowered and inspired me to get involved in politics. And within 4 years, I've not only become an elected rep, but have been in a position where I've been able to influence and advise our party political leader. So that's the American dream in action. It's not about what America can do for us, it's what we can do for each other and trying to embody the spirit of leadership and service. And I think on a personal level, if any American is listening and is particularly interested about how they can contribute, and I'm not paid by the Washington Ireland program, I promise, but I would actively promote hosting a student or indeed getting involved with like-minded projects and trying to experience some cultural aspects of where we're from as well. In terms of climate change, I was actually put on this evening because our party leader is known to go over a 2-minute slot. So really quickly, in terms of climate change, our party is not playing political football with this issue. We are the only party that's put forward a Green New Deal with evidence-informed and strategic actionable policies, not just looking at the highfalutin legislation that will grab media headlines, but also looking at things as just transition. Our Green New Deal is essentially a social justice document. It's not just about retrofitting houses and infrastructure, it's about making the green economy more access to people across Northern Ireland. Things like interest-free loans for electric cars. And can I just say, I don't think that any elected representative in this call could afford an electric car at the price of them at the minute, but also recognizing the things of poverty fuel, of the increase in poverty prices, making sure that people aren't left behind, focusing on investment in well-being in the planet and also in our infrastructure, and making sure that people aren't left behind. So I think that when it comes to climate change, we need to be serious about it. We need to be authentic about it. We need to merge these two pieces of legislation that are on the agenda at the minute, but more importantly, we need to come to this process with authenticity and with a genuine interest in humanity and what unites us rather than what divides us.
Thank you all so much. We are literally right at 3:02, so we have gone over. My apologies to the next panel. I wanted to thank you all for taking some time out of your evening to join us. We're really delighted to have you. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. I'm going to go ahead actually and segue us immediately into our third panel on the futures. And actually, Dr. Patricia Olin gave me a especially nice segue, because she herself has been involved with the Washington Ireland program. And our panel on the futures in Northern Ireland includes 4 young leaders, all of whom are affiliated with the Washington Ireland program. And we have invited them to imagine with us what the future of Northern Ireland might look like. So the first panelist is Mr. Gary McAllister. He is the Youth Development Officer for the Orange Order. Ms. Leah Ray is the Vice President of the Young European Socialists. Did I say that correctly? Is it Leah or Leah?
Leah, but can also answer to Leah. I'm a Star Wars fan, so.
Oh, okay, my princess. Ms. Camilla Manju is a healthcare worker, an activist, and a community liaison officer with the Belfast Multicultural Association. And we also have Ms. Kyra Reynolds, who is a Peace Barriers Program Development Worker with Triax Neighborhood Management Team in Londonderry/Derry. We're also very pleased to welcome Mr. Brian Patton, who is the Executive Director of the Washington Ireland Program, and he will moderate the panel. He helped us to construct it. And I want to make reference before we begin to the fact that everyone on the panel is speaking in a personal capacity and not on behalf of the organizations for which they work. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Thank you all for being with us, and I look forward to hearing you imagine with us what the future might look like. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberly, and really appreciate the opportunity. I know Camilla is having some technical difficulties, but I'm sure I'm not sure if it has appeared yet on the screen, but I know she's making her way in. So look, thanks everyone for joining. I know it's been like some fascinating panels, but it's just past 8 o'clock here, and I know it's been a long day, I'm sure, in DC as well, but excited to have this opportunity for what I hope will be a very optimistic, hopeful, and different conversation to what you've had as well throughout the day. So I'm going to follow the same kind of format as we've had on the previous panel, kind of a round robin. I'll probably be a little bit more flexible between questions. So we're only going to go through 3 questions with this group here, but and so I'll just kind of flag for the panelists that I'd be very happy and welcome after we do one round if people have comments that they want to make on this, on the talks that have been made. So yeah, Kuma is just joining us. So again, I'm not sure for those on watching in whether they can realize what she's listening in, and I hope will be able to join us on screen just in a moment. But I will go in the order of Kyra, Gary, Kumla, and Leah. So Kumla, don't worry, we'll give you a second to join in. So we're going to kick off, like I said, 3 questions. They're going to be around the biggest challenges we perceive. So we're really looking towards this is the futures panel. So we're looking over particularly the next 10 years. So what the biggest challenges we perceive, how Northern Ireland can overcome them, and how do we imagine, what can you imagine for Northern Ireland in 10 years? We'll be taking questions at the end of these 3 questions, and really warmly welcome questions from the audience. So please feel free to add that in. So Kyra, I'll start with you. I should add, I know you're kind of a Peace Barriers Program worker, but I should say it's also with the International Fund for Ireland, so which is how I know you through our work with them on the AMBIT program. So Kyra, you've got the hard question to kick off. well, they're all hard questions, but what are the biggest challenges you perceive for Northern Ireland at the moment? And maybe you could just give us a second or two, if you didn't mind, as well, about like give people a little bit of context of the work that you're doing as well, if that was okay.
Yeah, no problem. Typical, I have to go first, but yes, so I work for a Peace Buyers programme funded by the International Fund for Ireland in Derry, Londonderry. And the aim of that programme is to remove the physical barriers between communities. So I work on the interface between Bishop Street and the Fountain. We've had some achievements, but it's still very clear that that wall is not coming down anytime soon. Although we have seen improvement, and maybe that shows that there is hope for the future. We have had one of the structures that has been closed for 40 years opened on a 24/7 basis. So there is movement between communities now. So hopefully in this future sessions, that is hopeful. The challenges for Northern Ireland, I think whenever everybody mentions Northern Ireland, they automatically think towards the past, the conflict, and the need for peace building, and how far have we come on that? That's usually the question. But Northern Ireland's main problems at the minute are actually economic, related to health, related to divided education, related to poverty and disadvantage, especially amongst young people. And whilst that might seem like that's not related to peace building or politics, it's so related that, for example, the disadvantaged economic communities tend to be those working class communities in interface areas, which then means that there's no hope for the young people in those areas, which means they become involved in paramilitary activity, which is still rife because there's no alternative opportunities. Also, the economy is characterized by low skilled jobs and low educational attainment. So it seems kind of like there's a lack of opportunities that could lift us out of that kind of fog, political wise. I think as well, I'll go back to the political thing, whilst that my point in that was that we need to be future looking. Looking at long-term things rather than the short-term. But one of the main challenges, and everybody's going to say it, is the political structure. The fact that we still have a government that is so characterized by orange and green that we just focus on day-to-day issues of trying to get that group of people functioning and around a table, when in fact we're not focusing on good governance, maintaining good ethical standards. We're not focusing on the effective implementation of policy. That should be the main focus of the government, but it's not. We're still focused on just keeping it together after we had a 3-year hiatus when everything fell apart. So I think that is a key challenge, but again, wanting to highlight that Northern Ireland's challenges are economic, their health is not just political and related relations.
Thanks, Cara, and I'm definitely going to be coming back to that about, thinking about, well, also how the past impacts the present. Usually, I suppose we want to be focused on the present and the future. So thanks for that. And I suppose what I should have said as we were starting is that both yourself and like when we were convening this panel and we were thinking about it, is we want to make sure that people listening in here are getting voices and perspectives they mightn't have heard before. So like, I think it's great to have, your work in kind of Derry, Londonderry, like working at interfaces so that people kind of hear that perspective in your day-to-day work and what you're seeing and the challenges you're seeing for the young people that you're working with. So Gary, I'm going to move on to you if that's okay. And the same question, like what are the biggest challenges you're perceiving for Northern Ireland? And maybe if you wouldn't mind just giving, again, I'll re-emphasize that people are speaking individually, but just give people a little bit more of a sense of who you are and the work that you do as well would be helpful for context.
Yeah, so I'm Gary McAllister. I'm currently the Youth Development Officer for the Grand Orange Lodge of Ireland. I've been involved now in community youth work for about 12 years, which is why I've got a big beard to hide all the wrinkles under there and plenty of grey hair, but maybe not just as much as Brian. But my work really focuses on developing young people from within the Protestant, Unionist and Loyalist communities. And it has done for the 12 years that I've been involved in youth work and community work. In terms of the biggest challenge facing Northern Ireland, Kyra has hit the nail on the head with quite a lot of stuff. So, you know, there is going to be common themes between what we're saying. But I'll maybe be slightly more controversial. And I'll say that the Good Friday Agreement itself is probably one of the biggest challenges facing us. Now, that sounds like a bold statement to make, but the agreement itself is kind of a two-edged sword. It was successful in securing peace and laying the foundations for future generations to secure it and build on. The flip side is it's only as good as what you build on top of it. And, you know, the perfect example, if you build a house, the first thing you put in is the foundations. But if you don't put anything on top of it, it's not a home. It's not somewhere you're going to live. It's not somewhere you're going to want to live. And in that sense, the agreement is like an unfinished house. And the difficulty we have is, initially, people agreed to mandatory coalition because it was better than the violence and the death and the killing that we were seeing on a daily basis. But the problem now is no one had the courage or has been bold enough to review the agreement, analyse it, adapt it, or challenge it. It's held up as this be-all, end-all document that must be protected at all costs. And there's a fear to address some of the issues that run through it and some of the things that it hasn't addressed properly in 20-something years. And the reason people are maybe afraid to do that is because they're afraid of a return to violence. Now, the problem now is the absence of the courage to critically analyse and address the agreement and review it, as some of those fears are starting to remanifest themselves anyway. You know, just this week we've seen buses being burned because tensions are so high. You know, and that has been the case since Stormont collapsed a few years ago. It increased in the absence of Stormont. It increased in the absence of funding for projects such as the ones Kyra and other workers are involved in. And it's, you know, it's really hamstringed people. It's stopped people being able to do that peace building work that Kyra's talking about. And the tensions have now built to a point where I think that in my community, they're certainly dangerously close to bubbling over. As I mentioned, there's been buses burnt, but I mean, even just today, we've seen one of the loyalist negotiators who took part in the talks for the Good Friday Agreement coming out and saying that his party can no longer support the agreement. That's dangerous territory, especially when you go back a few months and you see that there's other ex-combatants of loyalist paramilitaries and other groups that are saying the same thing. They cannot endorse the agreement anymore. They cannot support it anymore. And we have to remember that without those people, we wouldn't have an agreement in the first place. And we forget that a lot. We seem to think it's politicians and elects. We ignore the fact that people that were doing the shooting and the bombing had to take part in those conversations to bring it to a halt and to push through peace. Now, one of the issues, and I mean, Kyra's already hit the nail on it, the lack of progress in bread and butter issues like education, healthcare, social housing, you know, they've been neglected because we've got a media and politicians who are quite happy to feed into the orange and green narrative and look at things through orange and green tinted sunglasses. And I think that's wearing thin on people. I think people are getting really tired of it because they're not interested in a culture package if it's at the cost of hospital beds, social housing being neglected, poverty lines and people using food banks. They're more concerned about those issues than they are about speaking a language or being given money because one side's getting it and the other has to get the same. And I mean, while we're debating that, we're ignoring those major issues that are facing us in education, health, and all the things I've just listed. So I mean, I'll give you an example. It's well documented that over the last 20 years that there's been educational underachievement amongst young Protestant men. Why have we not had any major reform of the education? You know, we still have we still have segregated education, and we're still happy to look at it in terms of Protestants against Catholics. Why is that not just an educational failure? You know, why are we not looking at it in terms of a wider thing rather than just Protestants? You look at the health service, the pandemic has brought a lot of things out. You've got incredible people doing a really tough job in really horrible circumstances, and it's close to collapse because we've ignored it and we've had no major reform. And I think a lot of that comes down to the structures that we have on the back of the Good Friday Agreement. I think we as a country and as communities have grown beyond the need for mandatory coalition. And I think what we need now is a normal, stable, functioning government, similar to what we see in the other devolved areas, such as Scotland and Wales. And there's people that's maybe thinking that that's unreasonable or it's unrealistic. But I mean, if I was to go to America and say, okay, we're going to force mandatory coalition on you. You can have joint President Biden and you can have joint President Trump. Does anybody realistically think that they could tolerate that for 23 years and expect there not to be massive collapses and not to be major challenges? Do you think you could have a functioning government to push those things through? So to me, that's the biggest challenge. You know, it's as if somebody has started the book, they've read the first few chapters, and they're afraid that they can't write anything better than the first chapter, so they just stop. And because they stop, we don't get to see how good the story can actually be. So that's what I would say is the big challenge.
Okay, Gary, there was loads in that, and like I think maybe if I was to just reflect on a few bits of it quickly before I go to Kumala next, is around, like, I think that idea of securing kind of foundations, the foundations analogy or metaphor is kind of nice, and I suppose it's up to the question then of, like, what are we building on top of it? I think for the benefit of those on the line, obviously the PUP were the party that kind of said today that they're kind of they could no longer support, to clarify for them, as I understood it, it's no longer support the current implementation of the agreement, rather than kind of walking away from kind of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement more broadly. And I hear, like, a difference from what you're saying there, from what they're saying, which is more on the, like, how do we evolve the agreement, and how do we that was resonates with some of the conversations and that were on in the last panel around it. How do we kind of reimagine, or how do we build the next phase of it? And both yourself and Kyra have really referenced a lot of the bread and butter issues as an example. And I think there's really good stuff for people on the call to look at, with Pete Shirlow and the University of Liverpool have a very interesting survey out this week around kind of what are priorities for people in Northern Ireland, and it is those issues are very clearly coming out towards the top. But then you have to question, like, what that doesn't necessarily reflect in terms of voting pattern, which I think is an interesting question, which is maybe the systemic one that you're talking about. So Kumala, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well. So we're talking about what are the biggest challenges that we perceive for Northern Ireland. You're very welcome, and thanks for persisting with the technology.
Thank you very much for having me. Apologies for the delay there. So my name is Camila, and I think for me, the biggest challenge is divided communities. That's what I think it is. Someone asked a really interesting question there with regards to culture. What does it mean? I grew up in Mauritius, a multicultural country. Culture meant so many different things to me growing up. It meant traditions. It meant being able to live in harmony with each other, no matter what your belief, your religion, your political affiliation is. None of that really mattered. We lived close with each other. We celebrated each of our festival, no matter what it was. So I would have, I didn't grow up as a Muslim, so I would have celebrated those as well, standing hand in hand with our Hindu brothers and sisters, no matter what it was. It was a culture shock being in Northern Ireland and realizing that culture, what it actually meant here, was totally different. It was orange and green. A lot of people have mentioned this already. And for me, it's the upmanship that I see in Northern Ireland. We just heard from Sir Donaldson, and he actually said it in words. Sometimes you think that these are things that you perceive it to be, but he said, I work for the union. What we want, what I want, is for political leaders to work for me, to work for communities. And the biggest challenge is that this is not what they're doing at the minute. We have so many, everything is seen as orange and green. Within the Good Friday Agreement, every conversation that we have is seen as that. Nobody talks about Black and ethnic minorities through the Trouble. What did they go through? We didn't live in a bubble. We're not apart from this society. We are a part of it. People served in the army. People died. People lost businesses. There was devastation within these communities as well. But you never hear about this. On Twitter, I've seen about how they were talking about how important it was that the Troubles were taught in schools. But within the two communities, everything is seen within a green and orange lens, and everyone else is the other. No matter how much work we do, no matter what we do, unless and until we're never going to have positive peace, true peace, unless and until we have integration. And we have to be very clear about what integration actually means. It means that everyone in a given country has a part in the whole, no matter where they come from, no matter what they believe. I will never, if I teach my kids, I have 3 kids, and I teach my kids that everyone is free to write whatever they want on their scroll of deeds. This is what I teach my kids. So people can do whatever they want, as long as you are safe, as long as they are not attacking you. But I wonder sometimes if other people are teaching their kids about that, about ours. My children are not young enough to be learning about racism. My daughter was only 3 when she faced a racist attack, when her hair was pulled, or my son faced attacks continuously. So no matter what I do, no matter how much I give to the society, I've had people clap for me last year. And I thought, you know what? Maybe this is going to be it. Maybe I'm truly going to belong. Maybe people are actually going to realize that I came to this country and I'm a full citizen. I'm contributing, I'm working really hard, and we're going to clap. But it didn't last very long. I went from being stoned to being clapped to being abused again. So we're constantly fighting each other about things. And Kira is so right. We're forgetting what actually matters. I don't want someone who's working for the union. I want someone who's working for the people. Things that affects all of us. How do you get to school? How's your mental health affected? What is the future for my children? I don't want them to be sitting on a platform like this in under the 10 years and having to talk about that. And I think political parties in Northern Ireland seems to underestimate the power that the youth are going to have, because from what I am seeing, this is not what they want. They want change, and the actual change that they want is not within the lens of orange and green or the other. They are broader, they think differently. And this is going to be a huge challenge. I think the next election is going to present itself as a huge challenge, because the balance could be actually within the other Black and ethnic minorities, because we forget that people like me also have a vote.
Thanks, Camilla. And yeah, I think it's, again, I think I refer back again to Pete Churlow's and the Liverpool work. It's very interesting to see in the last week that you know, the sheer numbers of people that identify in their context as other within that is like clearly, I think you're talking about both, I suppose you're particularly like talking within kind of Black and ethnic minority groups, but there's also like that challenging of the kind of green-orange lens that is viewed and how people are sitting within it. So yeah, I'm going to come to you next. Again, like I'm conscious, I know this is the futures panel. I want to be, and I know that all of us actually, as we've discussed before, we have a lot of positive and optimistic to say, but we're starting with the challenge. So people just stick with us. We'll just give it another 5 minutes of highlighting what a big hill we have to climb. And then I know that these 4 people are going to convince you that we're going to climb it afterwards. So Leah, could you give us a sense of what are you seeing as the structural and kind of biggest challenges that kind of Northern Ireland is facing?
Certainly, Brian, and thank you. And firstly, I just want to express my gratitude and appreciation for having the opportunity to be on the panel this evening / this afternoon for US time. And I think we've had a really interesting set of contributions so far. And I think it's actually very fitting that we start by discussing the challenges that are facing Northern Ireland in contemporary settings, but also what might be leading into the future, because I'm very much of the belief that you need to sit down and analyse and reflect on issues to properly understand the ramifications of those issues, particularly on citizens across the whole of a society, and to devise steps to implement that could see those issues rectified, to ensure full equality, inclusion, and also stability in the political system, which we have alluded to. So for myself, I think the issues or the challenges I think Northern Ireland is experiencing at the minute are very entwined, they're multifaceted. Firstly, as has been alluded to already, socioeconomic issues, particularly social economic inequality facing working class areas across Northern Ireland. I think what's particularly disconcerting is this is not a new phenomenon. This is historic. We have had detailed accounts of inequality and deprivation and high levels of poverty, particularly in working class areas since the creation of Northern Ireland, and yet over successive generations and successive governments, both devolved and at Westminster, no real action has been taken. And we need to consider what the ramifications of that is. When you have those high levels of poverty, what are the ramifications? Gary has talked about educational underachievement for one, but arising also from that, we have lack of opportunities in terms of employment and employment progression. We can see issues around people not having those aspirations to reach out and to challenge themselves to seek out different careers. And we can also then see ramifications around what we would call here the brain drain, not just particularly affecting working class communities, but all different types of young people across Northern Ireland who would think to themselves, there's no opportunities in Northern Ireland, we will leave to seek those opportunities elsewhere, and then they don't return. And we can have really educated young people who can make a real difference in the economy, in business, in education, in politics, in their communities, who are not here. They have gone and taken themselves elsewhere, and that issue has never really been addressed. And I suppose what I would like people to think about is, what would the future of Northern Ireland be, or how do we think about future in Northern Ireland when the young people of recent years have decided that they don't have a future in Northern Ireland? I think also a second challenge, again, it's a historic one, but also has contemporary impacts, is really around how do we enshrine or recognise and protect human rights and equality provisions in our constitutional arrangements, when we know that successive governments in Northern Ireland have not taken steps to ensure full rights and equality for whether it's LGBTQI people, whether it's in terms of reproductive health care, whether it's in terms of children's rights, or whether it's the recognition of migrant rights also. And I suppose we also need to think about, there's been a lot of discussion today around the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And for me, I think certain key provisions of that pivotal agreement have not been fully realised, notably the Bill of Rights, and what a change a Bill of Rights would make for all citizens in Northern Ireland, regardless of community or religious identity or cultural positions, because in fact, a Bill of Rights would recognise and affirm everyone's unique identity and citizenship rights also. But due to political connotations around human rights, it's never been progressed. And I think we've seen, particularly with Brexit, real concerns about human rights and equality and what that would look like if it was properly enshrined. And I suppose, thirdly, for me, it's been alluded to as well, there is a real sense of disengagement and disillusionment, I think, among Northern Ireland for the political institutions and devolution probably, and it's not been helped by our recent episode of an absence of functioning devolved institutions from 2017 to start of 2020. But there's also been people who for generations have felt that our political agreement, whether it's 1998 or successors to that, have never fully worked for them, or it's never really, the impacts or the aspirational provisions have never been fully realised in their communities. And we know political disengagement is not unique to Northern Ireland. It's a common trend now, whether it's in the United States or across Europe. But I suppose we have very particular circumstances and very unique history in terms of political participation and how people perceive political institutions and whether it's stacked against them or doesn't represent them. And so I suppose we need to think about what would Northern Ireland's future be if more people decide that the very agreement which establishes our constitution for contemporary Northern Ireland doesn't work for them.
Thanks, Leah. Big questions, and like I think that the really interesting indicator around particularly really important from a futures perspective is that, like, what future do young people see in Northern Ireland? And I'd point people towards like Pivotal and the work of Anne Watt and some of the work that they've done around that brain drain kind of issue. I think a very I'm sure a shared aspiration for political leaders and I'm sure for everyone on this call here is like, how can we have a Northern Ireland where young people want to live there and where young people of all communities see it as a place that's thriving? And that also links in, Gary, to some of the questions, the opportunity, employment opportunity issues that you were raising at the start as well. I think, Leah, you were kind of touching on pieces I think that resonated with Gary around, I suppose if we're going back to that house metaphor, which I'm going to stretch as much as we can, I suppose the architectural plans that we had for like a Bill of Rights and other aspects of it, some of those things haven't been built, and we're over 20 years in, so there's also this question of are we really going to go back and negotiate with the original builders around why they haven't done it, or like at what point, and maybe like Camilla, you were kind of touching on this a little bit around maybe there's a new generation that has to get engaged with all of this and think about how do we address it. So I'm going to move on to the next question, but before I do, I did say I'd give people an opportunity for input here on the panel. So does anyone want to respond to anything? I am going to be focused very quickly on solutions, but just in case there's anything that anyone wanted to add. Oh, I think we're okay. So like what I'd say is a aspect and a term we use in the Washington Ireland program is looking for tough-minded optimists. So we're going to apply some tough-minded optimism here. So we don't want to deal in the world of fantasy, but we want to deal, and everyone here, and the reason that we've asked you to join the panel is you're all involved in tackling these issues. So we can understand the issues, as Leah said, but then we actually have to go out and try and see how we can engage and make the world a better place around it. So how can we overcome some of these challenges? Cara, you've got the lovely job of starting us off. I'm going to be pretty quick, if that's okay, on this round, and try and kind of just I don't want to get through the next two questions quickly. So there's a whole rake of very great questions in the Q&A, so I do want to give some time for the audience. But Cara, what should we be doing to start tackling this?
I think to start this, I want to point out that what's really interesting is all four of us highlighted the same challenges. So it's not as if we're fighting unknown challenges. We know what they are. How do we overcome these? Well, because I mentioned the main challenge being good governance and trying to focus on making policy on long-term issues, I think that the solution would be more civic participation in policy making. And one thing that really made me hopeful was, I don't know if you guys have heard of it's relatively new, it's not new, the independent think tank Pivotal. And the fact that that's going to bring people from academia, it's going to bring people with loads of specialist skills into that debate on what policy on mental health should be, on what policy on healthcare should be, on the environment. I think that would be more effective, because then we're dealing with the bread and butter issues that the people want. It's actually really interesting because I just came off a Zoom call. I'm doing a Future Leaders program at the minute. And we were doing a session called the Assembly Session, and that was trying to teach us how to influence policy by showing us how we can get access to assembly members and stuff and get our issues raised. And it was really funny because, well, funny, but in a strange Northern Irish type way, that they had to highlight that political parties have manifestos that you can read, that you don't just automatically vote for the person that your family voted for all of those years, that they actually have beliefs and they actually have things that they're supposedly trying to aim to do, but people in Northern Ireland don't even tend to read those. So I think programs like that are educating people on how they can have a voice are really, really important, and they are happening. I mean, I've just participated in it, which is really good. Another thing that we discussed on Friday at a meeting with IFI was everyday leadership. So young people think more outwardly and more openly, more liberally than past generations, but they don't tend to be the people in power at the minute, but they don't believe that they have the power to change things. But IFI are looking towards succession leadership. They're looking towards what youth are going to replace the older peacemakers in Northern Ireland after they're retired or gone, and programs are starting to spring up teaching youth that they can have a voice, that they can do even through small acts, they can change things. And there is a Northern Ireland movement called One Small Act, and it could be the tiniest little thing that somebody does, donating to an organisation or something that changes Northern Irish society. Camilla, I really want to highlight the fact as well, you were saying about BME communities. How can we challenge this orange versus green? Well, firstly, to recognise that it's not orange versus green. We have a globalised society. We have so many people coming from different countries into our society. Those people make it really diverse. Northern Ireland is so insular because they're so focused on Catholic versus Protestant, but that means that there's so much hate crime because they can't accept difference at all. So to start to look at diversity as a broader thing, I think that would really help as well. But there are programs out there to do that. And in the Q&A, I've seen John, I think it was, he was talking about work that he did in the 1970s in Derry, trying to get youth out of situations. There is good people out there. There is people doing this work. It's just about finding the connections between those people so that we can have a bigger impact.
Thanks, Cara. And I think there's a few things that I think are going to be shared across the panel here, as in this idea of kind of good governance and civic participation, civic engagement. I think from my experience, the work that I've had with people across political parties in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of great people that are doing a lot of people are doing their best. But also maybe there's an element of where society somewhat has left it to the politicians, and actually the social kind of change is society wide, and they need help to create the space. So how can people get engaged around driving manifestos and getting involved in activism of all sorts to kind of participate? How can we kind of re-engage with the civic process? And I'm sure those that were involved in and reflect back on the Good Friday Belfast process would kind of think about, it wasn't an agreement of the political parties, and it was an agreement of the society that was kind of driven by huge participation from all sorts. And so I'll move on to Gary, if that's okay. Gary, what can we do to solve some of these challenges?
Again, Kyra's had the benefit of going first, so she's just summed everything up quite brilliantly. But I think there's a few things that, again, maybe I rock the boat a wee bit more and be a bit more controversial. I think we need new leadership. Now, that's not to say we need to just cull all politicians and get them out of the way and replace them. But I think we do have politicians on both sides who need to understand that they've done a job, but they're now getting to the point where the baggage and the trauma and the hurt that they carry around with them from their experiences of the Troubles is now becoming a hindrance to how they move their communities and move their country forward. And I think we need to have those politicians move on to create space for new voices to come through, because we do have young people who are more than capable of being members of assembly, councillors, whatever it may be. They're capable of taking those jobs, and unfortunately we don't find enough space to get them forward and get those new ideas into the conversation. I think we need our politicians, including those new voices, our community leaders, and the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, to sit down and honestly reflect and review and analyse the agreement and see what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has been achieved, what hasn't been achieved, and have an honest and difficult conversation with themselves as much as anybody else on how they can move the thing forward and how we as a society can move the thing forward. And I mean, we need to have those honest conversations, and we need to be bold in some of the things that we do and some of the things that we find, because we might not like a lot of what we find in it. Again, it's maybe quite cynical, but I think we need time, and we need time really for those generations who have suffered firsthand the hurt and the trauma of the Troubles. And as cynically and as horrible as it sounds, we need those generations to pass on so that people can start looking at things objectively who don't have the same level of firsthand trauma. And I don't say that lightly, but I think with all things, as long as you have people who have suffered and experienced it and went through it firsthand, it's always going to be more difficult for them to remove themselves emotionally and look at an issue objectively to see how we move forward. And a perfect example is, when you look at the victim stuff and you look at amnesties and conversations like that, I'm not sure what the statistics are. I'm not that way inclined, but I would imagine that a lot of the young people and people my age that sit around and talk about it would be quite happy to draw a line under things with certain conditions attached. Now, whether that's a case of there's an amnesty, but it has to go hand in hand with the truth recovery process, where if people can give the truth about what happened, they won't be prosecuted. Where they can't do that, they'll be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I think some people might go for that. Again, I don't know if everybody would, but it's about having those conversations about innovative ideas of how we can push things forward. I think fundamentally we need integrated education. You know, I'm ashamed to say it, but I was 16 years of age before I had a meaningful interaction with somebody from a Catholic background. And I was probably 18 or 19 before I had one with somebody from any other background, whether that's Polish, Slovakian, whoever it may be that I met. And that's not because my parents didn't want me engaging with people from other backgrounds. It's not because there was none of those people around my community. It's because they weren't at school with me. And you interact with the people you're at school with. And if there's no Catholics and there's no different ethnic minorities there, you're not going to engage with them until you're 16, 17 years of age. And by that time, you've already got preconceived ideas. You know, you've already got the myths of, oh, those guys all have crazy looking hair and they've this and they've that. It's just nonsense. If we can have those meaningful interactions earlier, it normalizes the fact that we are an extremely diverse society and we need to grow on that, and we need to, you know, really encourage people to share their culture and enjoy it and celebrate it, instead of weaponizing certain elements of it and trying to, you know, be territorial about it and say, no, that's ours and you can keep this and you can keep that. No, enjoy everybody's culture. I'm big enough and bold enough to say that Fela and Football is fantastic. I think I don't even know if I pronounced that right, but it's brilliant. Some of the stuff they do is phenomenal. I wish we could replicate some of the stuff like that, but for whatever reason, we haven't been able to do it within my community. But there's lessons to be learned from each other there that we maybe are just a bit hesitant to do. I think within the education stuff, I think we need to have an honest and frank curriculum that teaches our own history. Too many young people within our communities don't understand why we're in a divided society or why we've got to the point we've got to, and we need to really understand that. And the best place to do that is through school, but we can't airbrush it. It needs to go into all the detail and explain the thing openly and honestly with people. But ultimately, I think we need patience and perseverance, and we need to try and build resilience into our young people so that they can see the problems the same as the other three people on this call can see, but they're persevering at trying to fix them rather than fading away or going to somewhere else where they think there's better opportunities.
Thanks, Gary. Lots to think and talk about there. Like I think the maybe one thing I should say is that I'm completely conscious of the last panel, like the kind of John Finucane and Sir Geoffrey Donaldson were both, you know, people who were kind of, you know, the victims and legacy issues are such a challenging part of Northern Ireland's reality. You know what I mean? It's not just the past and how it impacts the present. I think I think there is kind of political agreement around there, like a rejection at the moment for some of the more recent proposals that the British government have put forward. But I think the kind of broader point you're making around like trauma and how that impacts on both kind of at individual levels and community level. I think there's a conversation around like community level trauma and what that impact is. I think there's this big question around, for Northern Ireland's future, how can its present engage with its past? So how can we both from a political and societal level have conversations about the past that actually facilitate some of the optimistic futures that we have an ambition towards? And I think that links into your kind of honest review and analysis of the agreements, which is, you know, how do we acknowledge that they are essential and absolutely necessary, but maybe not sufficient for what people hope for, and how can we engage with that? And again, maybe another theme, I think Kyra and yourself have been talking about this, another term we use in WIP a lot is the idea of like radical patience. Like these, you know, when we're talking about the challenges of overcoming them, these are generational issues that need to be engaged with persistently and determinedly to kind of address them. So unfortunately, when we're talking about these issues, like we're definitely not talking about short-term solutions. But how do we keep the grit and determination to keep addressing them? Camilla, I'll come to you next if that's okay. I'm conscious, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop our last question, but I'll go to the audience. But I might go to you next, and then I'll go to Leah. So on a the question as we have them is how can we overcome some of these challenges?
Thank you. I think politics needs to mature up. We need politicians to start speaking about the needs of the people and individuals whom they represent, not just their chosen political faction. And we can talk until I always forget the code. Is it until the cows come home or the chicken come to roost, something like that, about what hasn't been done about Good Friday Agreement, what hasn't been done about such and such 20 years ago. No matter how long and how much we talk about that, if it hasn't been done, someone said this today, if it hasn't been done for decades, the likelihood of this happening now is very little. But we need to be able to have hope when it comes to this. So the way that I see that we're going to be able to overcome these challenges is actually, especially when it comes to ethnic minority communities, is talking to each other. We're here on this platform actually talking to each other. You need to know, Gary, people from the Orange Order need to know what it feels like for me from an ethnic minority community to see Palestinian flags on top of a bonfire. How does that affect me when I'm walking past and my young kids are asking me, why are these on top of the bonfire? What does this mean? It's actually, it was baffling for me this year to realize that it's sold in a pack with the Irish flag, Palestinian flag. And so if you want things to burn, you can get them in a pack. It's so hurtful to have to explain this to kids. Belfast Multicultural Association was burnt down in January, but this was not an isolated incident. This was over a number of months. There was targeted incident, escalating incident that we talked to people about, that we told people whenever it did happen. It wasn't surprising. It was shocking, but it wasn't surprising because we knew it was coming, because they started attacking cars. So we know there's escalation. We can actually see these escalation. I think we need to stop hiding behind the fact that we need people have unconscious biases. I think it gives an excuse to people to continue on being racist, to continue on having sectarian thoughts and beliefs. For me to exist, my existence shouldn't be seen as a threat to yours. It shouldn't be seen as a threat to the fabric of Northern Ireland itself. And I don't just want a seat at the table. I want to be able to have a voice at the table. Whenever you have me talking at the table, you need to be able to value what I bring to that table. You need to honor that. You need to know that my existence shouldn't be a threat to yours, to anybody. We need to be able to work because it's taken so long. Every time we talk about racism, hate crime, or anything to do with ethnic minorities, people will always tell you, but it was much worse in the past. Just because it in no way diminishing any of the experiences that people have gone through in Northern Ireland in the past. We shouldn't always have to center this around these conversations. Whenever I'm talking to you about what's happening to me right now, because it's happened to people in the past, it shouldn't be now that it's my turn to be going through that. We should be able to have learned from whatever has happened, because it's been done in such a manner for decades and it hasn't worked. So clearly there's something wrong. Clearly the Good Friday Agreement may not be working for us, and we need to reimagine the society that we're living in, a society where everybody can actually truly belong without seeing each other as a threat. And so to sum up what I said, I think it's narrative. You need to be able to hear how people live. You need to be able to bridge that gap within people itself. If we are able to bring ourselves here, why do we not see all of these forums actually in person? Why are people not invited to hear about the work that Gary does, Kara does, or Leah does? Why does it have to be, I'm in this predominantly Protestant community, so I'm only going to work with them? That is not what the problem is. So much funding goes into doing these work, but they do it within their own communities. No, and often they talk about how Black and ethnic minority communities are hard to reach, but it's not. Anytime that I want people to participate in any event, I find them. How committed? We have political parties talking about the commitment. When the fire happened, there was tweets, there was comments being made online about their support, standing in solidarity. But these are just words. We need action. Your tweet is not going to stop me from being harassed or attacked on the streets. We need actual action. Even the fact that in Northern Ireland it's taken 16 years and we still do not have the racial equality strategy is very telling. People are still fighting over Good Friday Agreement and about the protocol, about everything else, and because we're only concentrated on our own. Because and there's a saying in Nigerian, Ubuntu, I am because we are, and it truly is. We cannot keep on fighting each other because we're never going to get anywhere. An eye for an eye make the whole world go blind. That's what I grew up with. So what is it? There's been a lot of talk about education. Yes, that's where it starts, because I refuse to believe that these teenagers throwing canister bomb or whatever it is they were throwing, burning down buses. This doesn't happen in isolation. These are taught behaviors. These are people being instigated against each other. These are things that we are actually teaching the future, teaching generation of the future. I don't teach my kids these things. So what is it that people are teaching their kids in their own home? I do wonder.
Great. Camilla, thanks so much for that. And I think I think you've said so much. I think there's such an interesting challenge there for us all around, again, I suppose you're recalling into how can we evolve and think structurally around, whether it be political parties, whether it be around like how government works and the funding of community organizations, as in do they replicate structures that they're trying to break down, and I suppose also there's another piece within all of this, which is I think there's frustration from all around kind of maybe Northern Ireland not achieving its potential, but there's also, to my mind, there's hope and optimism in the fact that there's actually a better story to tell. There is talent, there is people that can work together, and there's opportunity. So the question is, how do we do that? We're blowing wildly past our time. So there has been some answers in the Q&A that have been done in written form. But Leah, I'm going to let you close us out. Again, like how can we overcome some of these challenges? And then I'll just make some very brief remarks to wrap up.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was really fascinating hearing everyone else's thoughts on this really important question. And I suppose for me, not to sound like I'm quoting John Major here, but fundamentally we just need to go back to basics. I'm very much of the belief that we have the tools that we need in order to try to construct relations with civic society, to have proper political civil dialogue that's necessary to really tackle any feelings of disengagement or disenfranchisement first and foremost. I think the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, I've referenced it before, but I'll emphasise it again. I think very key provisions of the 1998 agreement have never been fully realised, and I do think there is perhaps scope by revisiting the agreement to see what needs to be implemented. I know there were great provisions outlined within the role of women, for example, in civil and political life. That's never been fully materialised upon. In Northern Ireland, we think it's a great success when we have an increase of 1% in representation of people who identify as women in the Northern Ireland Assembly, which simply in 2021 isn't sufficient. But I think even within that, our understanding of what constitutes full representation has changed massively since 1998. So no longer should be about just women. We need intersectionality in our politics and our political life and representation there. So we should really be striving for political representation at all levels, local government, the Assembly, whoever we send to Westminster as our MPs, to be really reflective of society here and not just to rehash narratives of the past, but to be more outward looking, to be truly representative of the constituents and what we want Northern Ireland to look like. We want Northern Ireland to be stable. That comes from a really full participation from the grassroots level into the political system. And I think the Good Friday Agreement gives us a blueprint in terms of how to properly implement that for 2021 and 2022, which for anyone on the call should be when we have our next Assembly election. And I suppose as well, I'm very much of the opinion we should look to incorporate best practice where it's available. And I know in the jurisdiction of the Republic of Ireland, they utilise citizens' assemblies for whenever they're going to make great decisions of constitutional importance. And I would love to see us in Northern Ireland have that type of dialogue, drawing on people at grassroots level. So not just our traditional career politicians, people who live and breathe in Northern Ireland, who get up in the morning and this is their life and they need to have a say in what Northern Ireland means to them and what the future will look like. And I think finally, to balance it to John Major quote, I'll go to Tony Blair with education, education, education. That's just key. I think to truly realise what the peace process means by way of a shared future, what the reconciliation, the term of reconciliation truly means. As someone who was born in 1993 and I've grown up under the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, we need to move towards not just a shared model of education. I think that's a good starting point. We need a fully integrated system of education. And by that I mean, we don't have this continuation of barriers in education and segregated education. We see enough of what happens when you have segregated communities. If we want our children to work together, children from all across different walks of life to work and live and participate in society together, that starts within the classroom, and that starts with learning from another and respecting each other's differences, but equally realizing that we're all in this walk and this life journey together. And I think if we can have some sort of mechanism by which our state education system is truly secular, truly inclusive, and education would be through religious sector that's private, I think we would see great change in Northern Ireland. I'm very hopeful and optimistic we might see an integrated model introduced in due course at some stage.
Great, thanks, Leah, and thanks to all of the panelists. So, like maybe a reflection is, one of the problems of Northern Ireland are shared. We started this conversation, the research that the University of Liverpool have come out kind of emphasised again. There are real issues of health, education, opportunity that are needed to be addressed. I think there is frustration that's clear on the how the structures are kind of working for people. But again, I think we've got to remember in the global context, political division and is not unusual, and it's not something that's kind of unique to Northern Ireland. I think there's a lot to be proud of in how Northern Ireland has worked in terms of what has been essential about the agreements. I think for the next 10 years, I think there is work to be done for a new generation to think about how can we renew and reimagine some of those agreements to actually work for everyone in society further, and to continue to be at the forefront of what kind of peace and reconciliation and that positive peace that Camilla was talking about earlier that we need to be. I'm for sure believe that the four people here on this panel will have a significant role to play in that future, and really appreciate the opportunity that Colleen, Kimberly and Carolyn and the Northern Ireland Bureau have given us to have this opportunity, and the Washington Ireland programme will keep doing our best to convene and support some of those conversations too. So thanks all, really appreciate this opportunity, and I think Kimberly and Carolyn and perhaps Colleen, we're handing back to you, and thanks so much for this panel and congratulations on today.
Thank you all very much. It was wonderful to hear from you, and I'm delighted that you would spend your time with us so late into the evening, sharing your thoughts and giving us some inspiration. We're really glad to have you here, and thank you to all of our panelists and our moderators. Thank you also to I would be remiss if I didn't call attention to the work that goes on behind the scenes through our events team and through our communications team. So Lisa Manning and Charles Leggett, Che Rao, and especially to Mackenzie Oldham, who put up with many versions of the program before it was finalized. I think, Carol, you had some words you were going to share.
I just wanted to also thank the sponsors, SPA, Northern Ireland Bureau, Washington Ireland Program, and SIS in Georgetown for bringing all of us together and managing to do it all over Zoom. And also the panelists. I know at the start of the conference, it was just before dinner time, and now we're well past dinner time. Almost all of our panelists were coming to us from Northern Ireland, so I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the moderators, Brian and also Tim, because you kept us on time, and that's a difficult thing to do, whether you're on Zoom or you're in person. So we're just really grateful for that. And also I want to thank the audience. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. There were a lot of really good and interesting questions in the chat box. We just couldn't get to them all because we had such great panelists and they had so many cool things to say. So again, thank you. We're really grateful.
Before we're done, may I mention two things, please? One is that there will eventually be a recording of all of the conference available on the SPA YouTube channel. It needs to be, I think, cleaned up a bit, and it will be captioned when it is made available, and that should happen within the next few weeks. I also wanted to thank my colleagues in crime here, Colleen and Carol, for working so effectively together on this and being such a pleasure to work with. May we do many further activities together. We look forward as well to working with the Northern Ireland Bureau and the Washington Ireland program in the future. Thanks to everyone. There is a reception for those of you in town at the Northern Ireland Bureau this afternoon, and you can follow up with them if you need more details. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.